Before we begin, I have a quick announcement. Try to remind you guys when we leave today, and I'll remind you again on Thursday. But there has been the time of the cram course on Friday. So first off, you guys have a cram course on Friday, and the time was what, 11 to 3. So they've changed the time. You can see it on your screen there. I've uploaded it into the online learning system for us. So the new time on Friday for your cram course is 8 to noon. Lane will email you Jane's Zoom link on Thursday. That's really hard to say. Try working with Lane and Jane. Lane will email you Jane's Zoom link Thursday morning. So make sure you're checking your emails Thursday morning. I'm going to say if you don't have this email by early Thursday evening, like by dinner time on Thursday, you need to reach out to Lane or I for whatever reason you didn't get the email. So please just be on the lookout for that. Please don't wait until 7:55 Friday morning and try to reach out to Lane or I. We don't know where we're going to be at that time. You guys check your spams too. Sometimes Lane winds up in your spam. I don't know why, but sometimes she does. So change a time for the cram course. Any questions on that? This Friday from 8 to 12. Also remember, we're going to talk about the rules and expectations for your end of class exam next Tuesday. So we'll go over that together, make sure we're all on the same page for test day a week from Thursday. Remember though, in the meantime, you guys can all be securing a distraction-free zone. So make sure when we show up a week from Thursday to take the test that you are alone. You don't have anybody in the room with you. If I see you having a conversation with somebody in the room, I can only assume you're talking about the exam, and that's cheating. And we have the right to take your exam if we suspect you of cheating. So be in a distraction-free zone for your test. And again, we'll go over those rules and expectations on next Tuesday, so you guys know what to expect. Your exam is going to be on class marker, which is what you guys did your midterm on. So hopefully that gave you a little bit of practice navigating class marker as well. The other thing I wanted to, good morning. The other thing I wanted to just point out, in the online learning system, right above the Julie folder, there's a 100% review. Have you guys poked around with this yet? 100% review, good, is a good culmination. So there's some practice final exams in here. Here's one, the class marker for Julie only. You guys can take that again and again and again and again and again. You can take that one as many times as you want to. With that being said, the test questions on this cram course exam are not the same as your end of class exam. So I wouldn't spend all your time just taking this test. But there is some good. You can see there's a practice final exam, there's national practice, state practice. You guys also have a comprehensive exam in the back of your book. So new book people, if you'll make a note to look on page 881, old book people, yours is on 819. If you didn't catch that, 881 and 819 in the back of the book is a comprehensive exam. So you got several here in your book, this 100% material. Trying to put it all together, I understand that. And don't forget too, you guys, in the Julie folder, I have your end of class exam review. So if you're not using this as a study guide, I encourage you to take a look at it. This content also applies to the retake if you're eligible. So I know we're kind of in the last minute throws. So hopefully these resources, 100% under Julie in your book, hopefully these resources will help you bring it all together. Questions or comments? Nice. That's a good idea. Like Post-its?
Like poster board, like big poster board. Sorry, I thought you said Post-its.
I know I did, but I'm trying, what are you doing on the poster board? Somebody's saying she put at her end of exam. So you're putting them on your poster board so you can see them?
So I'm going through the end of exam slideshow. I'm
So
very like visual, so I made like a bunch of printouts of like old car and stuff like that. So I'm kind
love it. Love it. And then you can have that. See, whatever helps you guys, whatever works for you guys. And Aubrey, if nothing else, as you're writing it on and cutting and pasting and gluing it on, you're seeing it again. And
yeah,
that's what I want you guys
for
to
sure.
to do, is to see it and hear it again and again and again. It's the power of repetition. So rewriting your notes, rewriting definitions. If you don't know what a word means, I promise you, if you write out the definition 12 times or 15 times, you'll know what that word means. So utilize some of those resources. Haley Ann's grabbed the whole exam. I imagine that's going everywhere with you. Yep, you just stuffing that thing in your purse and taking it with you when you walk out the door. That's easy to do too, isn't it? So kind of in crunch time, you guys. So hopefully we're in that mode. And again, don't forget, we're here as resources as well. So let me know how we can help. With that being said, we still got more material to cover. So we're in the throes of Unit 11, and this is where we left each other last week. Unit 11 is the relationship between the landlord and the tenant. I don't care if a real estate agent is involved or not. Unit 11 is specific to the relationship of the landlord and the tenant. Once we wrap up 11, we'll move to Unit 12. Unit 12 brings the broker into the picture. So we'll incorporate the broker as the property manager. And where we left, and I feel like I wanted to start here again today, because I feel like we're still 50-50 on the Connor Act and the statute of frauds. So I need everybody to be good. The Connor Act says that there are certain documents that need to be, say it with me, need to be recorded. Connor is about recording. There are certain documents that need to be recorded. Why? So that they are enforceable. Statute of frauds says there's certain documents that need to be in writing and signed. Why? So that they are enforceable. Both are an attempt to make these documents enforceable, but they do two different things. Statute of frauds says you got to have it in writing and signed. Connor Act says you have to record. Specific to leases, Connor Act and statute of frauds says they don't require leases less than 3 years to be in writing. Now that's a culmination. If you're entering into a 1-year lease and then you're renewing next year and the year after that, you're dealing with a 1-year lease. If you enter into a 3-year lease, if you enter into a lease today that expires November 2026, then that falls under this requirement, the statute of frauds and Connor Act. I think we all agreed that in practice, best practice is to get all leases in writing. I think we're all on board with that. But remember, you guys, your test is not going to ask you what you think is best. Your test is going to ask you about the statute of frauds and the Connor Act and what they say. So they say anything more than leases more than 3 years need to be in writing and signed, and they need to be recorded. So the next piece of Unit 11 gets into the North Carolina Residential Rental Agreement Act. And this is a good candidate for state-specific stuff because this is specific just to North Carolina. This is also just specific to residential property. This doesn't apply to commercial. So the North Carolina Residential Rental Agreement Act, its main purpose is to ensure only habitable residents are being rented. The landlord's #1 job under this act, #1 responsibility, is to make sure that their tenants have fit and habitable conditions. And under this act, the landlord cannot waive or alter their duties. Now, again, there's pre-licensing world, and then there's real world. We probably all have a story where we know somebody that said, well, if I fix this, can I just deduct X amount from the rent? And the landlord says, yeah, that's fine. According to the North Carolina Residential Rental Agreement Act, that's not allowed, you guys. If that's happening, that's landlord and tenant going outside of the act. So does it happen every day? Of course it does. What's your test going to ask you about? Your test is going to ask you about the North Carolina Residential Rental Agreement Act. The landlord's #1 responsibility is to provide fit and habitable conditions to their tenants. And they cannot waive or alter those duties or responsibilities. If the landlord fails to provide fit and habitable conditions, then the tenant doesn't have to stay. Remember what we said last week? If you stay, you pay. If you pay, you stay. Did y'all write that down? If you pay, you stay. If you stay, you pay. We are going to talk about the tenant's remedy in just a minute, about what happens if the landlord is failing to provide fit and habitable conditions, what the tenant's remedy is, and what they can do about that. Also understand too that if a property falls under the Residential Rental Agreement Act, the landlord can't deny these fit and habitable conditions. In other words, they can't try to find a loophole. So they can't say, well, it's an apartment and people are renting, month to month to month, but we call it something else. Don't let the name fool you. If it meets the criteria of the Residential Rental Agreement Act, then the landlord is obligated to provide these fit and habitable conditions. And we're going to look at a few examples in just a second. So if the landlord's number one responsibility is to provide fit and habitable conditions, what's the tenant's number one responsibility? What do they have to do? Number one,
Pay rent.
Yeah, they got to pay rent, right? So this is the exchange. This is the relationship. In exchange for me providing you fit and habitable conditions, you're going to pay me rent. I'm going to put a roof over your head and you're going to provide me and you're going to give me rent. So let's look, and we'll break down their duties and responsibilities. Let's look first at a couple examples. There's a building called the Downtown Hotel, but it is the primary residence of many of its occupants. Some occupants live in the building for long periods of time. Each unit has a living area and a kitchen. Because it meets the criteria under the Act, the occupants are residential tenant. The building is not a true hotel. We know how a hotel works, right? You go, you check in, you stay a couple of days, maybe a week, and you check out. You're not living there. That's what we mean by you can't let the name fool you. Just because it's called the Downtown Hotel, it fits the criteria of a residence. It does not fit the criteria of a hotel. So the landlord can't avoid their duties and obligations. If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a residential rental agreement property. And the landlord needs to provide those fit and habitable conditions. Here's another example. The landlord rents a deteriorating home to a tenant under a lease that provides, tenant hereby agrees to accept the leased home as is. Landlord is not responsible for the condition of the heating unit, wiring, or plumbing. Tenant agrees to be solely responsible for the habitability of the leased property. Yeah, no, that's not going to stand up in a court of law, because what is the landlord's number one obligation? Fit and habitable. And what falls under that? Heat, plumbing, electrical, all these things. You can't put that off on the tenant, put it in a lease and have them sign it. This would not stand up in a court of law because it doesn't meet those fit and habitable conditions. I will say this. Tenants, a lot of times, aren't aware of their rights. They don't know. They're not familiar with the North Carolina Residential Rental Agreement Act. And as we get into this act, we're going to learn the main purpose is to protect them. We've all heard of slumlords. We've all heard of those landlords that don't provide fit and habitable conditions. And that's what this act is for, you guys, is to protect the tenant, in some cases to protect the landlord as well. But I think the downside of this is a lot of our tenants aren't aware of this act. A lot of tenants aren't aware of their rights. So maybe as you guys get licensed, anybody going into property management? Few of you, handful. That's usually about what I get. Maybe, not sure yet. Julie, let me get my license first and then I'll figure it out. I hear you. I hear you. So if you're getting into property management, you're going to be dealing with tenants. And it's very important that you're even more familiar with this act than what we're covering, so we can protect those rights. So let's break down landlord and tenant under the act. So the landlord's statutory duties, as we said, is to provide that fit and habitable conditions. The landlord needs to comply with current building codes. If there's anything that needs to be repaired to keep it habitable, if the heat or the AC goes out, if the roof starts to leak, as we said, if there's wiring or plumbing or structural issues that affect safety. The landlord is also responsible under the Act to install working smoke and carbon monoxide detectors at the beginning of the tenancy. We will learn in a second under the Act that the tenant is responsible for changing the batteries a couple times a year. Did you guys change your batteries last weekend when you changed your clocks? Did you change your batteries? Yeah, I didn't either. I need to do that. Everybody make a note right now. But they say you're supposed to change those batteries when we change our clocks. So the landlord provides them. And then the tenant is supposed to change those batteries during the tenancy. So what if the landlord stops providing fit and habitable conditions? What if something breaks, something major breaks, and the landlord doesn't address it? Under the Act says that the tenant, after several requests, if those requests are ignored, let me rephrase that. After several reasonable requests, if those requests are ignored, if the issues aren't addressed, then the tenant has the right, their remedy is to evict themselves, referred to as constructive eviction. If the landlord fails to provide fit and habitable conditions, the tenant has made several reasonable requests. The tenant's remedy is to move out. Remember, if you stay, you pay. So if the tenant doesn't evict themselves, they're still on the hook for rent. Now let's talk about this. Let's talk about reasonable requests. Let's say we have a huge storm come through this week. Huge storm, and it damages lots of roofs in the area. There's only so many roofers. There's only so many hours in a day. Can everybody agree with that? So we got storm damage all across the land. Tenant calls the landlord and says, now the roof is leaking. Landlord calls his roofer. Roofer says, I'll be out the end of the week. Did the landlord do what they can? Did the landlord do what's possible? Now, maybe we go over there with a tarp or some buckets or something to address it until the roofer can get there. But the landlord can only do so much, you guys. They can't evict themselves because the roofer can't get here till Friday. That's not reasonable. Now, the landlord calls and says the roof's leaking, and the tenant calls and says the roof's leaking. The landlord ignores it. They delete texts, they delete emails, they delete all the requests. Now the tenant has a case for constructive eviction. They got to be reasonable. The requests need to be reasonable, and you got to give the landlord a minute to get somebody out there. So there's a difference in working on getting it fixed versus ignoring it and hoping that it'll go away. And that's what we're addressing here, are the landlords that ignore it and hope that it goes away. So with that in mind, if we look at an example, tenant leased a home with a 2-year lease. Several months into the lease, the roof developed a major leak. In spite of numerous complaints, the landlord made no effort to repair the roof and even tried to put the roof maintenance responsibility on the tenant. The tenant vacated the home and rented elsewhere. Even though the lease still had time, the tenant is relieved of further liability because the landlord's inactions constitutes constructive eviction. This is one thing. If I could teach one thing to all tenants, I was going to say in the state of North Carolina, but what the heck, to all tenants everywhere in the world, you know what I would teach them? Document everything. Because if this goes down, the tenant's going to want their communications with the landlord. The tenant's going to want to show, I called you, I texted you, I emailed you, I went by your office. The tenant's going to want to show those numerous complaints. Also under the act, the landlord has the responsibility of the common law, of the common areas. And this falls under a common law of negligence. If it's an apartment complex and there's common areas, breezeway, parking lot, playground, pool, clubhouse, gym, whatever that common area is, the landlord is responsible for that. And they're responsible for keeping that safe as well. Questions on the landlord's responsibilities, the tenant's eviction remedy, constructive eviction. You stay, you pay.
So Julie, if the tenant did the eviction remedy, would they have to take the landlord to court in order to get their deposit back at that point, since they technically breached?
Possibly. Well, they didn't breach because the landlord is the one that breached, and that's what
Yeah.
the tenant has. You know what I'm saying? So if the landlord's not willing to sit down and write a check, then unfortunately the two may have to go hash it out at court. And this is where I wish the tenant would go with their documentation. But yeah, if the landlord's, if two people don't agree, then the judge will decide for them. Maybe the tenant just cuts their losses, right? Sometimes it's better to be done, but yeah, if they want their money back and the landlord's not willing to give it, then we may have to have a judge decide for us. Let's talk about the tenant side of it. We all agree the tenant's number one responsibility is to pay that money, pay that rent every month or whatever we agree to. The tenant is also obligated to maintain the unit while they live there. The tenant needs to keep the fixtures and the home itself, clean. They shouldn't have damage. They shouldn't have destruction. I'm allowing you to live in my property. So there's that duty under the act that the tenant needs to keep the premises safe and clean. As we said, the tenant is also responsible for changing batteries in the smoke and the carbon monoxide detectors that the landlord installs at the beginning of the tenancy. So if the tenant fails to pay rent, or if the tenant fails to maintain the unit during their tenancy, the landlord also has an eviction remedy under the act. And the landlord's eviction remedy is referred to as summary ejectment. The only legal way for a landlord to get a tenant out of their property, a squatter, if you will, is to go stand in front of a court and have the judge agree to remove the property. Again, we all have stories of other eviction remedies, yes? Those aren't the legal remedies. Do you hear that major important word there? There's only one legal remedy under the act. And if the tenant fails to pay rent, if they fail to maintain the unit, then the landlord takes them to court and the judge will decide what to do. The landlord cannot engage in self-help eviction. Self-help eviction is changing the locks and not letting the tenant in to get to their stuff, or moving all the tenant stuff out in the front yard, or showing up with a shotgun saying, "Get off my property." That's not legal. Self-help evictions are not allowed. Also not allowed is retaliatory evictions. If the tenant exercises their rights as a tenant, maybe they contact an attorney, or maybe they contact a source because they don't believe they're getting those fit and habitable conditions. The landlord can't retaliate against them and say, "Well, you called the attorney on me, so I'm going to have to ask you to move out." That's what we mean by retaliatory. Every once in a while you hear on the news about some slumlord landlord that's not providing fit and habitable conditions. The last big story I heard about was an apartment building in downtown Greensboro. It's been a couple years. And guys, I don't remember how many stories this thing is, but it was a good sized apartment building. And those tenants were living under conditions with leaks. Leaks cause mold, bugs. I'm sure there were other critters scurrying around. And they weren't getting anywhere. They joined forces and weren't getting anywhere. And they ended up calling 2 Wants to Know. And they did a story on it. The landlord can evict them for calling 2 Wants to Know. That would be our retaliatory eviction. And if the tenant is paying and the landlord is collecting, we don't have a problem. Remember, if you pay, you stay. So this is a case where the landlord or the tenant is not paying. Questions on this? Also, under leases, commonly found in another North Carolina act, are security deposits. Security deposits are regulated by the North Carolina Tenant Security Deposit Act. Another good candidate for your state-specific section. This act regulates the amount of security deposit that the landlord can collect, and we will look at that in just 1 second. So it regulates how much. It also lists allowable uses of the security deposit. At the end of a tenancy, well, let me back up. At the beginning of a tenancy, the tenant gives the landlord a security deposit, and the landlord is to hang on to that security deposit throughout the tenancy. At the end of the tenancy, the landlord is going to refund either all of it or some of it or none of it. The landlord has to account for what they're going to do with that security deposit. They just can't keep it for the sake of keeping it. If they're going to keep the whole amount, then they need to tell you why. Reasons that you can keep those security deposits are things like late rent, you're behind on rent, and major damage to the property. Reasonable wear and tear is expected. Reasonable wear and tear is okay. Somebody's been living there. So there's the difference, and this is where landlords and tenants like to argue. There's the difference in reasonable wear and tear versus damage to the property. If you look in your books, 335 or 323, old book people, 323, it kind of gives us a list of idea of things that are ordinary wear and tear versus extreme damages. I would think worn carpet, where you walk, your path around the house. Worn carpet is normal wear and tear. That's just people walking in and out of the room. Holes in the carpet is excessive damage. A nail hole in the wall to hang a picture is ordinary wear and tear. A fist through the wall is excessive damage. You guys kind of see that difference. There's a, writing on the wall versus purple crayon on the wall. So there's some things there that are going to fall under ordinary wear and tear versus excessive damage. Again, if the parties can't agree to agree, then the judge will decide for them. Also, under the Security Deposit Act, the landlord, if they allow pets, they can choose whether or not they allow pets or not. And if they do allow pets, the landlord is allowed to provide a reasonable, non-refundable pet fee. This pet fee, the tenant is paying for the right to have a pet. That's all they're paying for. The right to have a pet. If the pet damages the property while they're living there, then we can withhold from the security deposit. So if you're charged a pet fee, it's just to have the right to have a pet there. When we get into Unit 19, we're going to introduce you guys to the American with Disabilities Act. And one thing we're going to learn under ADA is that service dogs are not pets. So if you have a tenant coming in with a service dog, the service dog is just an extension of that person. The service dog is seen as like having a cane or a wheelchair. They're aiding, they're assisting this person that falls under the ADA. You cannot charge a pet fee for a service animal, service dog. And if that service dog damages the property while they're living there, then you can deduct it from the security deposit. Before we get into the what ifs, let's look at our amount under the act, the maximum security deposit we can collect as a landlord, and it depends on the length of the tenancy. If it's a week-to-week tenancy, your security deposit cannot exceed 2 weeks of rent. If it's month-to-month, it cannot exceed 1.5 months. If it's longer than month-to-month, then your security deposit cannot exceed more than 2 months.
Can you flip back one slide? I just want to take a picture of it.
So what if? What if delinquent rent
Thank you.
and you good? Delinquent rent and damage to the property is more than what you collected in security deposit. You collect 2 months up front, tenant moves out, they were 2 months behind on rent, so right out the gate they're used up their security deposit, and then you go into the property and you find fist holes through the walls and torn carpet and purple crayon, and you find all these excess damage in the chat right there. The landlord has the right to take the tenant to court. So again, if 2 people can't agree to agree, then the judge will decide for them. We look at an example. A tenant rents an apartment for 1 year, $800 a month with security deposit of $1,200. With 6 months on the lease, the tenant abandons the property. They just run out. The landlord finds a new tenant who moves in 1 month later. The landlord's cost in obtaining the new tenant is $250, plus that month's lost rent of $1,050. The landlord is entitled to deduct that $1,050 from the security deposit, and the only thing the tenant is entitled to get back is $150. Again, the landlord can't keep it for the sake of keeping it. They have to account for what they're keeping. Does that make sense? I'm going to keep the rent that you didn't pay. I'm going to keep what it cost me to recarpet this room. I'm going to cost what it cost me to put new sheetrock up and hide the hole. They got to detail, itemize, if you will. Now, I'm not going to ask. I got a rhetorical question. Some of you may currently be landlords, and you have to hold your hand up. I don't want to know. Some of you may currently be landlords. And I need you to understand, if you are currently a landlord, once you get your license, anytime you're dealing with the public in real estate, you're going to be held to a higher standard. Because now that you're licensed, they know that you know? So if you are currently a landlord, have your own property that you rent, that's fine. I need you, new book people, it's at the very bottom of 334. Old book people, it's at the bottom of 322. A non-licensed landlord, a landlord that does not have a real estate license, has the option of keeping the security deposit in a trust account or a bond. Once you get licensed, as a licensed landlord, your only option for the security deposit is to keep it in a trust account. We're going to talk about that trust account when we get into license law and commission rule. Failure to keep the security deposit in its proper place, trust account or bond for non-licensed, trust account for licensed. Failure to keep it in the right place could mean that the landlord's not entitled to anything at the end of the tenancy. If the tenant knows their rights and it's not licensed, it's not bond, or it's not in a trust account, then the landlord may lose it all. So again, if you're currently a landlord, bottom of page 334, new book people, bottom of page 322, things to start thinking about, because once you get your license, you're held to a higher standard. Because now you're a real estate licensee dealing with the public. And what's the commission's #1 purpose?
Protect the public.
To protect the public. And that means from us, you guys. Questions or comments on the Tenant Security Deposit Act? Are any of you currently or working with a property management company right now? Few of you. I had I've had several over the years, and it's interesting. It's very, very interesting. But you think about it, property managers, I mean, if you got a 150 unit apartment building, you're dealing with a lot. You got a lot going on. And the book work and the keeping up with it and the ledgers, and every month you're collecting rent from those 150 units. The first is probably your busy day. The second or the fifth might be your busy day too, as everybody wait until the last minute. So the fifth is the busy day. Don't forget rent's due. Don't forget rent's due. The fifth, that's when everybody is due on the first, but everybody shows up on the fifth. I got it. So the first of the month, actually that was, yeah, because your fifth was Sunday. So things to consider. Another thing that's going to fall in the landlord-tenant relationship possibly is the North Carolina Vacation Rental Act. This is for vacation rental properties. So let's think about beach properties, mountain properties. Where are we vacationing? Lake properties, cabins in the woods, whatever. Winston-Salem's lovely, but I don't think people are vacationing here. So if you're in a non-vacation area, you may not be dealing with this. If you are in an area that deals with vacations, you probably will be dealing with this. Unfortunately, in pre-licensing, this is all we say about this act. So you're going to want to get further training, further information if you're in a vacation area. So what this act does is it regulates short-term rentals. The tenant has residence somewhere else. They're just here to play. They're here for vacation. The thing that I think we need to know about the Vacation Rental Act, if you sell your vacation property, the new owner under the act needs to honor anything on the books for 180 days after you buy it. So all those bookings, all those reservations, once you buy, you need to honor those for the next 6 months. If you're buying this for a vacation property, you can keep all bookings on because you already have it. But if you're buying it for yourself, if you're buying that big old beach house for yourself, for your primary residence, then you need to know you can't come down here for a couple months, 6 months after you buy it. One last thing in this section, dealing with public housing, sometimes referred to as low income housing, sometimes referred to as Section 8 housing. Section 8 housing, the landlord has even further obligations to provide fit and habitable conditions. The government comes in and regulates these fit and habitable conditions. So the landlord has a little bit more work to do, but you know, for the landlord, the good news about low income housing or Section 8 housing is if the tenant can't pay, the government will subsidize the landlord. The government will help out. So you don't have to worry about tenants not paying because you have the government backing there. So there's pluses and minuses to everything. Tenants can't be evicted unless there's a good reason. I'm sure if you as a landlord sign up for public housing, you'll learn about those good reasons and what those rules are. But just know that these tenants have a little bit more protection, and so does the landlord. Questions? Okay. So Unit 11. Those key terms are back on 321. We talked about things last week like a leasehold estate, non-freehold, the different types of leases. We also talked about the different ways that rent can get paid. Also on last week in this unit, we hit some of the highlights of some common provisions that are often found in a lease. You got that key point review on page 346. And then your student quiz starts on page 348. And then there's some quizzes in the online learning system as well. Questions on the landlord-tenant relationship. Maybe an agent's involved, maybe they're not.
Miss Julie, I have a question.
Please.
Like the landlord basically might enter the lease premises to repair or whatever the case is. Should that be on the contract?
It needs to be, because
Okay.
if the landlord doesn't put their right to enter in the lease, then the landlord has zero right to enter. So it's
Okay.
got to be added. It's often found. It is often found. And it might say, I have the right to enter after I give you 24-hour notice, right? So I just still can't just show up if I have the right to enter. We still need to be courteous and give the notice, pending an emergency, of course. If
Right.
your water heater blows up, I'm going to need to get in, you know, so pending emergencies.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Anything else? So with the understanding of everything that we learned about the landlord-tenant relationship, now let's bring in the agent, also known as the property manager. The property manager, the real estate agent, the licensed agent, is hired to manage the property on behalf of the owner. So this is going to define that relationship. So in this unit, our guide, we're going to explain property management. We're going to look at our property management agreement, or talk about a property management agreement, some of those basic elements. And we're also going to talk about some investors in this unit, because property managers work with investors. Landlords are investors. They purchase a property, an investment property, collect rent, and that's how they get their money back. So we got to do some investor math at the end of this unit. And this is the last time we will pick up a calculator in this class. Is that hard to believe? No more math after today. Woohoo! All right, so before we jump into Unit 12, let's just refresh. And let's remember, we talked about these activities that require a license. So the transfer of real property. When we're talking about the transfer of real property, that's when we're talking about the activities: list, lease, buy, exchange, auction, negotiate, or sell. If you can remember LL Beans. Anybody like to shop at LL Beans? Or at least peruse the catalog and wish? Okay, if you like to wish, I got nice stuff there. If you like to dream with LL Beans, and that may help you remember, the transfer of real property for others for compensation. And specifically where we are now in this unit is the lease piece of it. And remember too, you guys, all three activities are required for a license. Some of you, as I mentioned, may be your own landlord. You may own your own investment property. You are the landlord and you are leasing it. If you're doing it for yourself, do you need a license? No, because you're not doing it for others now. If your name is on the deed, that's the key. If your name is one of the names on the deed, you're not longer doing it for others. You're doing it for yourself. So you may currently have management property. And when we say compensation, remember we're saying any form, anything of value. So it may not be that I'm going to pay you. Maybe in exchange for helping me manage my property, I'm going to offer you free rent. Is free rent something of value? Heck yeah, it is, especially in today's days, right? Free rent is something of value. So when we say compensation, yes, we generally think of money, but compensation is in exchange for anything of value. So we're leasing. If you're leasing for others for some form of compensation, then a license is required. As long as you're doing it for yourself, you're okay. Under the definition of the commission, the property manager has to be an active agent, active licensee. They cannot be a provisional broker. And they are working with the owner under a property management agreement. Our agency agreement in this relationship is the property management agreement. I got some questions for you guys. Why don't you set your private chats? Under a property management agreement in a private chat, what does the property manager owe the owner? What does the property manager owe the owner under a property management agreement? It's our agency agreement. Love the question marks. Property management agreement is an agency agreement. Under agency agreements, the licensee owes their clients OCAR. We entered into an agency agreement together. Instead of me listing your house to sell it or me helping you buy your house, now I'm being hired to manage your property. So property management agreement, that's right, it's an employment contract. Thank you. It's an employment contract. The property manager owes the owner OCAR. Under a property management agreement, what is the classification of agency? Universal, general, or special? And you can say UG or S in the private chat. I know what you speak of. UG or S, universal, general, or special? Yeah. Under property management, our classification of agency is that of a general agent. The property manager has some ability. They have some decision-making authority. They have some ability to make decisions and to bind their client. Let's think this through. Let's say you own 10 investment properties and you hire me to manage those 10 investment properties. If I had no power whatsoever, that would mean every day I have to call you for every little thing. Can I collect rent? Can I change the furnace filter? Can I fix the hot water heater that just blew up? I'm calling you for every stinking thing. And at some point you're going to go, why am I paying this girl? She can't make a decision. So because of the nature of the relationship, it's general, which means the property manager has some ability. How much ability do they have? It's got to be spelled out in that property management agreement. So for example, the property management agreement might say that the property manager is authorized to fix all repairs up to $500. So if something breaks that's $499, I can fix it. I may FYI you the next time we meet, but I can run out and fix it. If something breaks that's $501, now I got to call you. So that's what we mean by some authority, some ability. The property manager is a general agent. One more question before I break. Tell me in a private chat, Y or N, yes or no. Is the property manager, the property management relationship, is working with real estate agent disclosures required? Working with real estate agent disclosure required in property management, Y or N? Dan? The answer we were looking for here is no. Working with real estate agent disclosure is only required with sales transactions. You're not hiring me to sell. You're hiring me to lease. Now, can the property manager disclose their agency status? Sure, and many times they often do, real world versus pre-licensing. Commission rule regarding the working with real estate agent disclosure says it's only mandatory for sales transactions. Again, it's not what you're going to do, it's what the laws and the rules tell you. That's how we need to focus for our exam. Questions on that? Not required. Also, a thing that we commonly see in property management relationship, property managers often have lots of unlicensed employees. So there's some difference in the unlicensed employees with the property manager that versus that for the sales associate. We're going to talk about unlicensed employees when we get to our license law and commission rule. But just know there's a lot of property managers. There's only one licensee in the whole firm, and everybody under them is under that of the property manager. So as long as you're working under the property manager, the licensees. Questions so far? Property management. All right, let's take 10. When we come back, we're going to talk about what the property manager does for like a minute. are back. So I am taking attendance. Let's talk about this property manager. No. Can you guys see? Can you see my screen, my PowerPoint? Okay. And thank you for letting me know you're back. I have taken attendance. When in doubt, just tell me you're back. All right. So let's talk about this property manager. First off, it's important that we understand what their primary function is. And the primary function of the property manager is to preserve the value of the property while generating income for the owner. Remember, the owner is an investor. And what's an investor in the business to do? Make money. So the property manager, if the owner is paying a property manager to manage their property, the expectation is they can generate them an income. They can help them make money. So the property manager is going to be tasked with making sure that the property meets fit and habitable conditions, as well as getting tenants in, collecting rent. I mean, guys, if this place is vacant, neither one of us are making money, are we? We're not collecting rent. We're not making money. So the property manager is wanting to make sure that they can get that rent. So some basic functions. The property manager is going to market the property in between tenants. Maybe the tenant and or the landlord choose not to renew the lease. Maybe the tenant skips out in the middle of the night, whatever. Market the property to get another tenant in as soon as we can. Property managers are often dealing with expenses. They're going to help the owner budget. We'll talk about that in just a second. They're also going to help the owner control those expenses. They may select what to fix and when. Again, there's things that make fit and habitable conditions, and then there are other repairs. So how are we going to address those other repairs if we're going to? Controlling those expenses. Controlling tenants, or securing tenants, securing tenants, getting qualified tenants in place. We're going to get into Unit 19 today. And one thing, Unit 19 is our fair housing unit. And one thing we're going to learn from fair housing is that what we do for one, we do for all. So every single tenant applicant that comes in has got to be handled the same. Are we going to do an employment check? Are we going to do a credit check? Are we going to do a background check? I can't answer all that for you, but what I can say is once you pull the background check for one tenant, you need to be pulling the background check for all tenants. Once you look at the credit for one tenant, you need to look at that credit for all. So your process of securing a tenant should be across the board for all tenants. Property manager is the one that gets to collect rent every month. They also get to hang on to secure the security deposit. Because the property manager is licensed, they're required to keep that security deposit in a trust account. Rent is often also rolled through the trust account. Once the tenant pays rent, then the property manager will pay the expenses. They'll pay themselves. They'll pay the owner. So it runs through the trust account typically. And then the property manager needs to report to the owner. The owner's going to want to see what's happening to their money. Remember, they're an investor, so they want to see their money grow. They want to see this investment property pay off. So there's various reports that the owner may require the property manager to turn in. We'll look at those in just a second. What types of places use a property manager? So it could be an apartment complex. It could be a single family resale home. You could have one investment property. You could contact the property management company and have them. We could also be dealing with commercial. So you could be looking at an office park or a retail center, something like that. You could be property manager of, so what types of properties? Anything. Does the owner have to hire a property manager? No. Just like the owner doesn't have to hire an agent to sell, An owner doesn't have to hire an agent to manage their property. However, if they do get us involved, then that's where we're helping the owner make that money, help them secure their investment. Thank you. This list isn't inclusive. This just kind of gives us an idea. We do know, though, some things specifically that the property manager cannot do. The property manager, as you go through this, you will see this has to do with the owner's money. I can make suggestions. I can make suggestions on a capital improvement. I can't actually do the capital improvement. A capital improvement is something that adds value. Painting a room is not a capital improvement. Updating the 30-year-old bathroom and kitchen, that is a capital improvement. Finishing the unfinished basement, adding a room to the back of the home. Whenever you add value, adding square footage, etc., the property manager, again, they can make suggestions. They can say, look, this bathroom and kitchen is out of date by like 30 years. If you consider updating, I'll probably get you some more rent. Can make suggestions, but as far as actually making the capital improvement, property manager cannot do that. They can't reinvest the owner's profits. It's their money. The owner's still on the hook for paying their taxes. And then the property manager shouldn't be establishing a depreciation schedule. Depreciation is just the loss in value for any reason. That would be the job of an accountant. So a few things a property manager is not to do. So let's talk about our property management agreement. This is the agency agreement, the employment contract that the owner uses to hire the property manager. The owner, anytime you're doing anything with the owner of a property, we must have our agency agreement in writing from the inception. So when you're working with the seller for sale, when you're working with the property manager for rent, we cannot work under an oral agreement. Everything is in writing from the inception. We cannot perform a single service without having that in writing. A question comes in about how many trust accounts the property manager needs, and we will get to that when we get to license law and commission rule and talk about our trust account. But to answer your question, the only time you would need more than one trust account is if you're managing HOAs. And the general rule of thumb is each HOA gets their own trust account. But otherwise, a property manager can have one account, they can have two, whichever. The property management agreement, the agency agreement, tells the authority of the property manager. As we said, it may specifically say in there that you're authorized to do all repairs up to X amount. So how much that authority you have has to be spelled out in that property management agreement. And when we talk about any agency agreement, back in Unit 8, we talked about the 4 musts of an agency agreement. Agency agreements must be in writing. They must be signed by all parties. They must have the non-discrimination clause, and they must have a definite end date. Make a note, Unit 8, go back and refresh the musts of an agency agreement. All agency agreements have a definite end date. But one unique exception to the property management agreement is that it may allow for an automatic renewal. We still have a definite end date, but if we sign a property management agreement for, I don't know, a year, and within that year, we're getting along just fine. I'm making you money. I'm not bothering you. You're paying me. It's a good relationship. We're happy. At the end of that year, we could agree to automatically renew it. We have a definite end date, but the property management agreement is unique in that it does have that automatic renewal, whereas our listing agreement and our buyer's agency agreement does not. Look with me, if you will. I think I'm going to skip ahead just a bit. Maybe. Let me find it. Not too far. Look with me on page 354, new book people. Old book people, you are on 334. So 354 and 334. Now, we're not actually going to look at the property management agreement. You do have it available on the online learning system if you'd like to check it out. But what we do need to understand is some of those provisions that we can often find in the property management agreement. So again, 354 and 334. Of course, we need a description of the property or properties that we're going to manage. There's our contract period, beginning date, ending date, whether or not we're going to allow for that automatic renewal. The property management agreement is an employment contract. So it needs to spell out how the property management is going to get paid. Are we going to get a percentage of rent collected? Are we going to get a flat fee? That needs to be spelled out carefully. Defining the property manager's responsibilities, the extent of their authority, what are they and are they not allowed to do without the owner's approval. How the property manager is going to report to the owner. The owner wants to see their money grow with financials, with numbers. So how are we going to report? And remember, you guys, our agency agreement is a bilateral contract. It's a two-way street. So there's responsibilities of the owners as well. The owner has to comply, along with the property manager, with North Carolina acts, such as the North Carolina Residential Rental Agreement Act, the North Carolina Tenant Security Deposit Act. Remember, now you have an agent involved, so we are all held to a higher standard. The owner is also responsible. They have to maintain homeowners insurance. They own the property. They need to secure the structure. The tenant, more often than not, will be required to have renter's insurance to protect their stuff. The owner also is still responsible for paying taxes each year. If they are making payments through a bank or a lender, then it's probably escrowed and they're paid on their behalf. But if the investment property is paid off, then the owner needs to make sure that they pay those taxes. Duties upon termination. The property manager has been managing the books for this owner for the last however long. And now that this relationship is ending, one of the biggest duties of the property manager is going to be to get those books to the owner. Also, another thing that the property manager is going to have to deal with, not all tenants are going to get notice to send rent next month to the new property manager. So they may still have money coming in and they need to address how to handle that with the landlord. Do I send it to you? Do I send it to the new property manager? So a lot of times when this relationship ends, we still have some loose ends to tie up, and that should be spelled out. And then miscellaneous. So if we have to take each other to court, that's often spelled out. If the property was built prior to 1978, then the Lead-Based Paint Act kicks into for residential, only for residential. If the property was built prior to 1978, there's a lead-based paint disclosure for the lease side of it as well. Help educate the tenant about the possible dangers of lead in the home. So that just gives us again, a general idea. Again, all the things that we talked about in agency agreements back in Unit 8 is going to apply here as well. This is an agency agreement. And I'm being hired specifically to manage the property. So what are some of the duties, typical duties of the property management agreement? Again, understanding that everything is agreeable, anything is negotiable. One thing that the property manager should have early in the relationship is a management plan. And the management plan is going to outline the owner's objectives, like if they still owe the lender, if they still owe the bank money, what's their goal to get this property paid off, for example. So what are the owner's objectives? What do they hope to accomplish out of this property? Property manager is going to help with market analysis. They got to look at numbers. Property managers often pull comparative market analysis or CMAs to find probable lease price. Remember, we looked at our CMAs for probable sales price, but now here we are managing a property. We want to know what reasonable rent in this area is. So those CMAs to find probable lease price can help study in the market, study in the area, all very similar to sales. And then the specific property analysis. Again, if there's certain repairs we can make, maybe we can get our owner more money. We don't have to fix everything. We do have to keep it in fit and habitable conditions. But maybe if we do decide to upgrade the kitchen, then we can collect more rent, for example. So what specifically about the property can help the owner preserve the value while generating an income for them? And one of the big things that the property manager does is report to the owner. Maybe it's on a monthly basis, maybe it's annually, maybe it's quarterly. The property manager should help the owner with the budget. Budgets are always done in advance. Some of you may be ready to sit down the first of the year and figure out your family budget and figure out next year, how are we going to afford to take a vacation? How are we going to have Christmas and birthday parties this year? You got a budget for some of those bigger expenses. Happens if your water heater blows up. So budget for that so they don't come out and hurt you. And keep in mind, this is done in advance. So I don't know for sure. I can't tell you for sure, but we can plan for it. And that's all we're doing when we're budgeting is we're planning. Is there a really good chance something can break this year? Sure. I don't know what's going to break, but if it does break, I want to know that we're budgeted for it. So the operating budget looks in advance. What can we expect to happen this year? Throughout the year, the property manager may do a cash flow report. This is our income and our expenses. Usually these are generated monthly, so the owner can see their cash flow. It's like a snapshot of today's financials. Again, the property manager often is handling this piece of the owner's finances. So they need to report that. They need to show what's happening with their investment. When we talk about cash flow, we're referring to money coming in, money coming out, income and expenses. Your income is all the money that you have coming in, not just what you're collecting in rent, but do you have a vending machine on the property that generates income? Do you have other services that generate an income? So we're looking at all the money coming in. Expenses then look at the money going out. Some expenses are fixed. What we mean by that is it doesn't matter if you got a tenant in place or not. We still have these expenses. For example, this year's taxes. Do you think the county really cares if we have a tenant in place or not? No, the county's saying, pay me taxes. That would be a fixed expense. Variable expenses may depend. If the tenant moves out, you need an expense to get the unit cleaned up and ready for the next. Landscaping. We're not using our landscapers as much this time of year as what we are. So these are variable expenses to take into consideration. And when it comes to these reports and incomes and expenses, a common report is the P&L statement or the profit and loss. Profit and loss looks at revenues and expenses, and bottom line, it answers the question, did we make money this period or did we lose money this period? P&L. And then at the end of the period, the property manager, remember we did our budget at the beginning of the year, for example. And now that we're at the end of the year, we're going to do a budget comparison statement. This is what we predicted was going to happen this year. This is what actually happened this year. And this will help us do our budget for next year. This will help us get ready so we know those expenses to plan for this year. So again, just to give you an idea, we just saw a lot of green stars, so we're not spending all of our time on this, but this just kind of gives us an idea of some of the reports, some of the things that the property manager will help the owner with. Questions on these reports? Remember, the owner in this relationship is an investor. So the property manager's effect is assisting the investor. And one tool that we've already seen that the investor cares about, y'all remember Violet? The investor, this is our income capitalization approach formula where we had to solve for the net operating income. And the investor cares about that net operating income. They care about that capitalization rate, their rate of return. So we started back in Unit 17 with our PGI, our potential gross income. If I were collecting rent 100% of the time, what's the max I can collect this year? From that, we deducted our vacancy and collection losses. And that gave us our effective gross income, or how much are we actually collecting. Then we look at our operating expenses, management fees, janitorial expenses, landscapers. Deduct our operating expenses from our EGI, and that gives us our net operating income. Now that we're here talking about investors, we're going to take this formula and expand on it. So the first step is going to be to find the net operating income. Investor math then kind of takes it a little bit further. From your net operating income, if you were to deduct your debt service, remind me, what is your debt service?
Principal and
Principal
interest.
and interest.
Principal and interest. So if you deduct your debt service, not taxes and insurance, just principal and interest from your net operating income, that gives you your before tax cash flow. That's the cash flow you have before you pay your taxes. Pay your taxes, and now you have after tax cash flow. Sometimes investors take advantage of the debt service to have less taxes. So sometimes they can use their money to help for them, to help work with them. And for the property manager and the investor specifically here, to understand these numbers and how that works, and that may help them maximize their after-tax cash flow, which is pretty much what they have to put in their pocket. They have paid everything. They have paid everybody. And so what's left now after you pay your taxes is that after-tax cash flow. And bottom line, that's what the investor cares about. Collect all the money, pay everybody. What do I get out of it? What's in it for me? And no, this is not the math in Unit 12. This is just taking that formula we had. I don't think you'll see this bottom part of it math. You will have to solve for net operating income for the income capitalization approach. But again, this just gives us an idea of what happens to that money. Couple terms that investors use. Investors like to leverage their investment. Have you guys ever heard the saying, it takes money to make money? Have we heard this? This is leverage. This is what they're doing. Again, taking the use of those borrowed funds, for example, has a higher debt service, which means they would pay less taxes. So they can leverage their investment. They can use that borrowed money to finance the investment and to at first realize a larger after-tax cash flow. So taking borrowed money, using money to your advantage. Another thing investors, and actually all homeowners, care about is something called equity. Equity is the money that you have in the property. I got a formula for equity that I need you guys to write down because we're going to play on this in just a bit. Value minus debt equals equity. The value of the property, what is it worth today, minus your debt, what's your loan amount, that's the money that you have into it. The day you buy your house, you buy $100,000 home. You ask the lender for $80,000. The day you buy your home, you often have equity into the property, not unless you go in at 100% financing. How you build that equity then all revolves around value and debt. increasing your value and decreasing your debt is going to build your equity. How do you increase your value? Well, we could have appreciation. If depreciation is the loss in value, then appreciation is the gain in value. As the market value goes up, you're going to have appreciation that's going to increase your value. Another way to increase your value is to do a capital improvement. Finish the unfinished basement. Give yourself some extra total heated square footage. Add a room to the back of the house. Update the kitchen and bathroom. Something that adds value is a capital improvement. And then the other way you could build your equity, pay off your debt. Every time, even if your property doesn't increase in value, if it doesn't have appreciation, every month you make that mortgage payment, you are adding that much of the principal to your equity. So how do we solve for equity? We're going to build on this. Everybody have this written down? Value minus debt. And this is the fun math we'll get to do in just a bit. Questions on equity? So some typical property management duties, again, mostly all negotiable between property manager and owner. But one of the big things that the owner is going to want the property manager to do is to rent the property. Again, if we don't have a tenant in place, neither one of us are making money. So when finding the tenant, when renting the property manager needs to follow the North Carolina Residential Rental Agreement Act. They need to follow the North Carolina Tenant Security Deposit Act. What we do for one, we do for all. So the property manager establishes a tenant application process. Set it up and treat all tenants the same. We said they're going to find a rental schedule. What's a reasonable rent for this property in this area? Several different tools. I got you. Several different tools. The property manager, they could do that CMA to find probable lease price. They're familiar with the market. They know the area. They know what's happened to rent in the last couple of years, in the last year or so. What do we know about rent? It's blown up, hasn't it? Property managers are watching this, making sure that they're getting that investment, that payment for their tenant. I'm sorry, for their owner. As we said, marketing the property. If the tenant moves out, or if the tenant skips out in the middle of the night, or if the lease ends, how are we going to get a new tenant in place? What work do we need to do? What damage do we need to repair? And how soon can we get a tenant into place so we can start making money again? Are we going to put signs in the yard? Are we going to advertise on MLS or Craigslist? What are we going to do to market the property? Qualifying and selecting tenants. We've talked a little bit about this process, but one thing I'd like you guys to consider, the owner hires the property manager, not the tenant. However, the property manager and the tenant are the ones that are communicating on a regular basis, at least once a month to collect rent, right? If something breaks, the tenant's calling the property manager. The tenant has the relationship with the property manager, but the property manager doesn't owe that tenant OCAR because the tenant didn't hire the property manager. Now, they still owe them what? If you don't owe them OCAR, what do you owe your customers? Honesty,
Fairness,
here we
and
go.
disclosure of material
Disclosure of
facts.
material facts. Let's do that again. So what would the property manager owe the tenant? Honesty, fairness, and the disclosure of material facts. They don't owe this tenant OCAR. The property manager needs to be very, very, very careful not to cross that fine agency line. Always remembering that everything they do, anything they do, is what's in the best interest of the owner, not the tenant. So in selecting tenants, the property manager needs to take things like, what are the tenants' needs? Think specifically of a commercial property. If you're renting like in a retail, is the retail space big enough for your store or your restaurant? Obviously doing some kind of check to make sure that the tenant can afford to pay the rent. Property manager is the one that's going to collect rent each month. They're going to be the ones to maintain the security deposit. Yeah, they often have unlicensed employees or even licensed employees to assist, but they're the ones that are ultimately responsible. As we said, maintaining the property, keeping up with the maintenance. I mean, homes they just require maintenance. What needs to be done and when. In your books on page 361, new book, 341, old book, it just gives us an idea of the different areas of maintenance that the property manager should consider. Preventative maintenance is just regularly scheduled activities. You got to paint every once in a while, put a fresh coat of paint on the outside every once in a while. Repair or corrective is something actually breaks. We need to fix it. We need to repair it. Routine is just our day-to-day activities, maintaining the common areas, changing the furnace filter, making sure the furnace filter gets changed on the regular. And then construction maintenance. This could be allowing for an upfitting if you're in a commercial, or maybe now in the residential, 30 years later, we finally decided it's time to update the kitchen and the bathrooms, for example. So just different areas of maintenance property manager needs to take into consideration. Property manager also needs to take into consideration environmental concerns, especially if the tenant is an industrial tenant, a warehouse tenant, making sure that they're properly disposing of their hazardous materials. All property managers, environmental concerns, things like mold, lead-based paint, asbestos, all that good stuff that scary stuff that we saw in Unit 21. Property manager still has to maintain that. Make sure that the tenant is complying with environmental issues, properly complying. I think we said this last week, but every once in a while you guys see what pops up on the news that a tenant at a restaurant or somebody in the restaurant was caught dumping grease in the creek out back. And when they sourced the grease back to the restaurant, y'all, they're not calling the tenant. They're not calling the property manager. Who are they calling? The owner of record. Do we have a happy camper? Not at all. Their very first call is going to be to their agent that was supposed to prevent this to begin with. So making sure that the tenants are complying, not just with environmental, but any rules and regulations. What if it's a residential property in an HOA? The property manager is responsible for getting those regulations, those HOA docs, at least letting the tenant know what they can and cannot do under the HOA. And then, as briefly mentioned, again, we're getting into more of this in Unit 19, but complying with the American with Disability Acts. ADA applies to public spaces, public accommodations. In ADA, it's required that all employers with 15 or more employees comply with ADA. So, possible answer solution on your test. All employers have to comply with ADA. What do we think? Yes or no? All employers? No, just those with 15 or more employees. Everybody hear me? Watch that word, all y'all. All y'all? Fall, y'all. Okay, watch that word. Watch that word, all. It means, it's the littlest word I know you'll see on your test, and it means so much. So only those with 15 or more employees. And basically what the ADA says is that all commercial, all public accommodations in places with 15 or more employees has to make accommodations to the public, even those with disabilities or handicaps. The big picture of ADA says that everybody should be able to access the same thing as everybody else. ADA is not going to make employers make major modifications. They're not going to make them change the building themselves. However, they are going to make the employer make accommodations, reasonable accommodations for those with any disabilities. Let's say, for example, you have a 2-story building that was built in 1960. I just made a year up. In 1960, we didn't have the laws that we have today. In 1960, 2-story buildings weren't required to have an elevator. They're not going to make you build an elevator. They're not going to make you modify the building to build an elevator. However, they are going to make you make accommodations for those people that may not be able to access the second floor. If you ever decide you want to rebuild, major repairs or demolition and rebuild, and you're applying for a building permit, guess what? Now they're going to make you comply. You with me? So they're not going to make you do it unless you're ready to upgrade, unless you're ready to do it anyway. And that's going to be part of your permitting process. But again, the big picture here is that we make this service, we make this available to everybody. When we get to Unit 19 next, we're going to look at fair housing, which is the star of the unit. Fair housing focuses on the individual unit, the individual house. ADA takes off where fair housing leaves off. Fair housing is about the space, the private space. ADA is about those public accommodations. So if you're a property manager and you have 15 or more employees and you have one of these large apartment complexes, you have to comply with both fair housing and ADA. And as a property manager, the owner, well, they got to follow. Once you bring an agent in, we all have to follow the same rules. So again, we'll do a nice side-by-side comparison of fair housing and ADA. The other thing about ADA, let me say this now so I don't forget. ADA is the one that does recognize service dogs. Fair housing does not have a species restriction. ADA specifically says service animals are dogs. Do not confuse a service animal with an emotional support animal. ADA does not recognize emotional support. ADA only recognizes service animals, service dogs. If you own a public place and you have 15 or more employees, you cannot deny a service dog in your place of business. You can't ask a lot of questions like, what's the dog for? What's wrong with you? Can we all agree that that's just not cool? So you can't ask a lot of specific questions. However, you guys, unfortunately, and this saddens me so bad, do people take advantage of anything that they can? Sure. I mean, it's not hard. I haven't looked, but I feel fairly confident if we went to Amazon this afternoon, we could buy a service animal vest for our dog. Does that make them a service animal because we slap a vest on them? No, service animals are trained. They have a job. They have a very specific job to take care of or for their owner. So you can't deny them access. However, once the dog gets in there and they start acting out, if the dog gets in the building and piddles on the floor and starts jumping up and down on the other customers, now we can ask them to leave because that's not how a service animal acts. We can't deny them. That's right. We can't deny them. And remember, emotional support animals are not service dogs. ADA does not recognize emotional support. Y'all remember, it's been a while now, 5 years, 8 years. I don't know. Time gets away from me. The lady that tried to get on the plane with her emotional support peacock. You remember her? I don't make stuff up. I just watch the news every once in a while. You get all your laughs in one day there, right? Yeah. She tried to get on the plane with her emotional support peacock. And the plane said, yeah, no. And guess what? They were in the right because ADA only recognizes dogs. Again, fair housing has no species restriction. So if the landlord and the tenant agree for the tenant to have their emotional support peacock, then they can. It's only ADA that has the restrictions. Questions or comments on this? Again, we'll compare this again in Unit 19 with fair housing. Fun fact, ADA also used to recognize service animals. They also used to recognize miniature ponies. As of a few years ago, they don't recognize miniature ponies anymore. So if you come across some old literature, the only thing they recognize today are dogs. The last piece here is talking about risk for the property managers. Risk asks the question, what will happen if something goes wrong? Is something going to go wrong? There's a really good chance. What? I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. But in life, I know there's a really good chance that something could go wrong. So the property manager may want to consider some risk management and some things that they can do to alleviate or avoid everything going wrong. Maybe they can avoid it. Maybe they can remove the source of the risk. Maybe they can retain it by taking a deductible out on their insurance or the owner's insurance. They could control it by taking preventative measures to make sure it won't go wrong. Or they could just transfer it, take out a whole new insurance policy just for this risk. I think a great example of that is the pool. The pool is about the riskiest thing in an apartment complex. There's lots that can go wrong. Yes, kids skipping the fence in the middle of the night, things can happen. So you might choose to transfer it, take out an insurance policy just for the pool, have the pool separately insured. So again, property manager needs to be on the lookout for risk. There's no way we can alleviate all of it. But if they take some risk management steps, they might be able to control some of it. Save you money in the long run, right? Sometimes you take some steps up front today, could save you time and money down the road. And that's what the property manager is trying to do. And that gives
So
us
would maybe
yeah.
like for the swimming pool one would like maybe fencing it in or something?
That would absolutely help control it. That would be preventative measure. We put a fence up tall enough with barbed wire so kids can't climb over it in the middle of the night. Absolutely. Absolutely. With that being said, though, be careful because the fence itself doesn't start. I have a condo in High Point and we have a pool. The fence is there. They just didn't lock it every night. You know how I knew that? Right. So what good does that fence do if it's never ever locked? I was young when I bought my condo. I moved in, I did dumb things. I just didn't get caught. Umbrella, that's right. That's right. An umbrella insurance policy covers it all. Absolutely. Again, you guys, all insurance is on the owner. Owner's responsible. So the property manager's helping the owner make these decisions. We could avoid a lawsuit if we take out a separate policy just on the pool, for example. The owner makes the bottom line decision. And that gets us through Unit 12. Unit 12 is short and sweet. There are a lot of green stars in Unit 12. Listen to me. You're going to have test questions on Unit 12. I often hear students come back and say, there's more from Unit 12 than what I expected. I think Unit 12 is another one of those units that gets swept under the rug, because when I asked how many of you are in property management, I saw like 3 hands. The rest of us don't really care about it, do we? I need you to care about it to get you through your exams. So please don't discount Unit 12. There's a lot of green stars, which means we just need a very basic understanding. But don't discount it. So those key terms back on page 351. Your key point review on page 366. And then your student quiz on 368. Now we're going to do math that's related to Unit 12, but they don't have it in Unit 12. So I do want you to look at the math concepts on 365 new book, 345 old book. So 365, 345. The math concepts in the book is talking about the property management fee, the compensation structure, and really, back to our sales units. Commission is part of the sales price. Well, often in property management fees, commission is part of rent collected. So instead of basing it off the sales price, we're just basing it off of rent collected. It might be that it's a flat fee, for example. But this just gives us an idea of the structure. I don't think you'll be tested on this. Again, the math that we do in Unit 12 is not really here, but it's our investors' math. It's tools to help the investor, math to help the investor. And that's what we're going to focus on when we get back. And it is in your book. It's just not in Unit 12. So I'll point out those places for you when we talk about it so you have your reference. Questions on the non-math piece of Unit 12? I know we're just a little early for break, but before we start this math, I think we should take 10. So y'all go ahead and grab your calculators. When we come back, we're going to do some investment math. So let's take 10. I can see you. I'm going to take attendance. And let's do some math. Specifically, let's do some investors math. Couple sources. It's really kind of funny. Did y'all know there's formulas on the inside cover of your textbook? What? Who looks at the inside cover of a book? I never did. Somebody had to point it out to me. So where do we get our sources for this math? Well, let's go to the inside front cover. You can see a lot of the formulas that we use. The second column is finance math, and at the bottom or near the bottom is going to be our percent of equity increase that we're getting ready to talk about. So that's what they give you for that. And then the inside of the back cover, go the whole way to the back. And again, some more math that we've talked about. And there's your profit and loss. So this is what they give you. Now they got a couple practice problems for you guys. Of course, we got some more in the online learning system. Show you where all that is. The first piece of math that investors care about is profit and loss math. Do I have a profit or do I have a loss? And when it comes to profit or loss, one thing in particular that they want to care about is their amount made as part of their amount paid. So here's our formula. Amount made is part of the amount paid. If what you paid is more than what you made, you have a loss. Could have a loss. The amount paid is what you bought for it back in the day. The amount made is the difference in what did you pay for it versus what did you sell it for. So let's do this. Let's say I give you $100. Here you go. Here's $100. And a couple weeks from now, you give me back 125. How much did I actually make? What was my amount made? I see your mouths move. That's right. Just the $25. Everybody with me? That 100 was my initial investment. That was my money. You gave me back 125. So how much did I make? I only made $25. So our amount made is the difference in what we paid for it versus what we sold it for. We're going to do one of these together using our T-bar. I want to make sure you guys have it jotted down. So we'll work through one together. And then, of course, I'll let you guys try one on your own. Does everybody have this? Amount made is part of our amount paid. They good? All right, let's talk about Rachel. Rachel buys a property for $38,000, sells it for $62,000. The question is, what is her percent of profit? We've read the question. Let's throw down a T-bar. And what we're solving for, percent or rate, always goes where? Always goes in the bottom right. So our X is the percent. She bought it for $38,000. That was what she paid for it. She turned around and sold it for $62,000. So what her amount made is the difference in what she paid for it versus what she sold it for. So we have our $62,000. So now we have her amount made. She made $24,000. Again, if you sell it for less than what you paid for it, you have a loss. The only way you can have a profit is if you sold it for more. She sold it for more by quite a bit, didn't she? She had a pretty nice. So her amount made is the difference in what she sold it for versus what she paid for it. Questions on how I got the $24,000? Or why? And thank you guys for telling me you're back. I think I have. Yeah. That fourth line on the T-bar means divide. So 24,000 divided by 38,000. On my calculator, I get a rate. It's like 0.6315789. That's the rate. The question is probably going to want the percent. You convert a percent or a rate to a percent by moving that decimal over 2 places to the right. Your calculator gives you the rate. If the problem asks you for the percent, you need to move the decimal over. So what was her percent of profit? 63%. Amount made as part of amount paid. Questions? You also got your chats set to private. Now it's y'all's turn. Tell me in a private chat what's your percent of loss. Be done in a minute, and then we'll talk about it. Okay. So you buy property for 72,000 and sell it for 69,000. Question wants to know what's your percent of loss. Did you guys need the problem to ask you what your loss was? You bought it for 72, you sold it for 69. Did you have a loss? Sure, because you didn't get back what you put into it. So this one was helpful. It asked you for this, but understand you could have a profit if you make more, or you could have a loss if you make less. So we read the problem. We can use our T-bar. We know what we're solving for is our X, our percentage on the bottom right. Let's start with what you paid for it. Your amount paid was $72,000. And to find the amount made, or in this case, the amount lost, we need to find the difference of what you paid for it versus what you sold it for. How do I do that today? There. There. So we have a difference, amount lost, amount made, amount lost of $3,000. That fourth line in the T-bar means divide. So you take 3,000 divided by 72,000. And on your calculator, you get 0.0416666. You move that decimal over 2 places to the right, and you get, I'm just going to round here a little bit, 4.17%. 4.2 I saw. Again, try to go out to do 2 decimal places. Amount made or loss over what you paid for it. I know some of you said a negative, and that would it's going to do one or the other. It's going to ask you for a loss of 4.17 or negative 4%. So one or the other, as long as we understand we had a loss. Percentage of profit or loss. Amount made is part of amount paid. Questions on this one? As always, my question to you, if you didn't get it right, do you see where thumbs up? Awesome. That's what I like to see. Light bulbs. Love it. Perfect. So percent of profit or percent of loss, we're looking at amount made. It's part of amount paid. Before we get into the next piece, I want to do a quick refresher. Remember the gist, T-bar 101. I think we did this at the end of unit 2 when we introduced you to the T-bar. And when we look at T-bar 101, most of the time, one way we can remember is what number goes on top, what number goes on bottom, is we know that most of the time, the part is the smaller of the 2 number. And these are the samples we've seen all along up until this point. Your part is going to be smaller than the whole. This next formula, you may have a part that's bigger than the whole, in which case your percentage is going to be greater than 100%. So whenever the part is bigger than the whole, that means the percentage is more than 100%. And specifically with investors math, what we're looking at now is the present value as part of the original value. You'll solve for one or the other, present value or original value. And the percentage that we're looking at with these is the percentage of the seller's cost. Now I'm going to talk about that percentage of seller's cost next. Let me make sure you guys have this jotted down. Your present value is part of your original value. The percentage in these cases, if your present value, if what it's worth today is more than what it was worth back in the day when you bought it, then your percentage of seller's cost is going to be more than 100. So when we're talking about this percentage seller's cost, everybody have so far? Have your T-bar jotted down so far? Good, good, good. The percentage of seller's cost, we got to think just a little bit different when we're dealing with this number. We need to think of 100% as our starting off point, because 100% is what the seller put into it. It was their investment when they bought this property. If they have a profit, then we're looking at a number more than 100%. If we have a loss, we're looking at a number less than 100%. 100% is your starting point, meaning we're either going to add to it or deduct from it. Take everything you thought you knew about counting and switch it just a bit. The original value being 100%, that meaning that's what the investor put into it. That was their original value, what they paid for it back in the day. Now you're selling it. If you sell it for more than your original value, you have a profit. If you sell it for less than the original value, you have a loss. Once again, we're going to do one of these together, and then I'll let you guys do one on your own. Everybody ready? Oops. So a home listed for 285, sold for 275, gave the seller 10% profit over the seller's cost. Question wants to know, what was the seller's original cost? Oftentimes, you guys, I like to start with where I want to end. And what I mean by that is identify your X first, because that helps you rule out the distractors. That helps you see what it is that you're solving for. Do I care what the house was listed for? Does that mean anything to me whatsoever? No, there's your distractor. Again, if we don't understand, if we don't know this, then we're trying to do something with that 285, but don't. What I care about is what it's sold for. My present value today is $275,000. Then define the percent of seller's cost. I draw it out. So I have my counting, and I'm going to start with 100%. This is where we start when we're counting this present value and original value map. Because they had a profit, that means we're going to take 100% and add to it the 10% profit. So the number that goes in the bottom right is going to be 110%. They had a profit, so we're going to start with 100 and add to it. Questions so far? That fourth line on the T-bar means divide. So 275,000 divided by 110% gives us the original value. How much does this investor pay for this property back in the day? They paid 250,000. They sold it for 275, which gave them a 10% profit. Again, the 100% is where they started. That's the starting off point. Profit you add to, loss you deduct from. So for example, had this problem said that you had a loss of 10%, here we go. Had this problem said you have a loss, instead of putting 110% down there, we would put 90, because we would think of 100 as our starting off point and deduct 10. Everybody good with that? Start with 100. Profit adds to, a loss deducts from. In this case, we had a profit. So what did you pay for it? 250,000. Questions? In a private chat, tell me about Stacy. 30 more seconds, and we'll talk about it. What do we do first? Just read. Read and breathe, breathe and read, right? Good advice. All right. So Stacy invested in a mountain cabin a few years ago, made no improvements to the property. She just sold the cabin for $80,640, losing 16% of her investment. What did the cabin cost Stacy? So now we can use the T-bar. What we're looking for here is the original value. What did it cost her back in the day when she bought it? Today, the present value, it's worth $80,640. That's what she sold it for. The question wants to know, what did she buy it for? What was the original value? Then to find Stacy's percentage of cost, we think of 100% as our starting off point. Stacy had a loss, which means from 100, we need to deduct. So if you take 100 minus 16, we get 84%. Start at 100. You add for a profit. You deduct for a loss. So Stacy's percent of seller's cost is 84%. Up down line means, I'm sorry, back forth line means divide. So 80,640 divided by 84% tells us Stacy back in the day spent $96,000 on this cabin. Present value is part of original value. If the original cost is more than 100%, this is the example of the T-bar that we have where the part is bigger than the whole. When we have a profit, when that original cost is more than 100%, the part's bigger than the whole. In this case, we have a loss. Questions? Very good. Can I erase? Okay. Last piece of investors math, as promised, is dealing with equity. Want all of you please remind me in a private chat, you can abbreviate, I know what you speak of. How do we solve for equity? So our basic equity formula is value minus debt. So we're going to have to solve for equity first by giving the value and then deducting the debt. Equity, value minus debt. Please write that down. Everybody good so far? So what we're dealing with now with investor math is going to be a percentage of equity increase or decrease, in which case we're looking at another T-bar. The change in equity, you're dealing with original equity. What was your equity back in the day when you bought it? Compared to your equity today. The difference is going to be your change. Equity today versus equity when you bought it is part of your original equity. If you guys saw the amount made as part of the amount paid formula, we're saying the same thing here, only we're saying it with equity. So we're looking for the change in equity, the difference from your original equity to today's equity, and we're going to compare it to your original equity. Amount made as part of amount paid. So you're going to have to solve for equity in these problems twice. You got to find new equity. You got to find original equity. How do we find equity? Value minus debt. Again, we got one we're going to work together. And then I'll let you guys do one when we're ready. We're ready? We have our formulas? I see the excitement. It's overwhelming. Okay. A property is valued today at $50,000. It has an outstanding loan of $45,000. Later, the property is valued at $60,000. The loan has been paid down to $38,000. Question wants to know, what is the percentage of equity increase? I've read the problem. I may not know anything else at this point, but I know I can use a T-bar. I also know what I'm solving for is percent. Percent and the T-bar will always be on the bottom right. So this is a great place to start. Before we start plugging in the T-bar, I got to find equity, both today's equity and tomorrow's equity. So today, our equity, my value, let's see, this is original equity, right? Yes. In this case. So we have a value of 50,000. You have debt of 45,000. So what's your original equity? What's it worth today in this case? Your equity is $5,000. Again, equity is the money. It's your money. It's the money you have invested in this property. So it's worth 50,000. You owe the bank 45. So what's your money? Your equity? $5,000. Everybody see that? Value minus debt. Fast forward to later, and we look at our new equity. It's increased in value. Now it's worth 60,000, and you've paid off your debt. So you're going to have an increase in equity. Today, or new equity, later, this says, equity is 22,000. How do we build equity? Increase value and decrease debt. It only revolves around those two pieces, value and debt. Questions so far: how I found original equity, what it's valued at today, versus new or later equity. Now back to our T-bar. Original equity goes in the bottom. And the equity that goes on the top is the difference in equity, the change in equity, if you will. So my difference in equity is $17,000. Again, if we saw that amount made as part of the amount paid, we're doing the same thing. We're finding the difference and we're comparing it to the original. That fourth line in the T-bar means divide. So you take your change in equity. Nope. Divided by your original equity, which on our calculator We get 3.4 is the rate. This problem is asking for percent, so I need to move that over 2 decimal places and get 340%. What was your percentage of equity increase? 340%. $3.4 is the rate. The percent is 340. Test will ask you for one or the other. All 4 answer choices are either going to be a rate or a percent.
So they won't give us 3.4 and 340%.
They can't because they're saying it's saying the exact same thing. 3.4 is 340%. So no, they cannot. Questions? Change in equity is part of your original equity. The key, the trick, is to find your equities. Your turn. Tell me in a private chat about McKinsey's percentage of equity increase. You got 30 more seconds, then we'll talk about it. Talk about McKinsey. McKinsey bought a home 5 years ago for 220,000. She had a loan of 176,000. Now the home is worth 260,000. Her loan is down to 162,000. What is her percent of equity increase? We read the formula. I know what I'm solving for is a percent. I know rate or percent. Always, there's another one of those absolute words, always goes in the bottom right. Take that out of your think tank. Rate or percent always goes in the bottom right. So now we got to find our equities. And let's start with our original equity. When she bought the home 5 years ago, the value was 220,000 and she had a loan of 176,000. So when she bought the home, her equity, her original equity was 44,000. Value minus debt. Fast forward with her new equity, now the home is worth 260,000. It's had appreciation and or capital improvement. And she's gotten her loan paid down to 162,000. So today her new equity is 98,000. Equity buildup. Increase your value, decrease your debt. That's how you build your equity. By the way, when you pay this loan off, it's all yours. You have 100% equity. You get whatever it's worth. That's what we talk about, that American dream thing, is to build equity so your home can pay for itself. Questions on how I got the equities. Original equity versus new equity. I know my formula. So I know my original equity goes in the bottom left. That's the whole. The number on top is the difference of equities, the change of equities. So if I find the difference, I have a change in equity of 54,000. So my difference in equity, I compared my new equity to my old equity, and my change in equity. That fourth line on the T-bar means divide. 54,000 divided by 44,000 gives me on my calculator 1.227.27272 and so on. Or if we move that decimal over 2 places, that's the rate. And then we have a percent, 0.73, we'll say, depending on how far out you went. 122, 123. Again, you're not going to miss by rounding alone. So if you don't round like I did, what I mean by that, you guys, is the answer choices. They're not going to give you A is 123%. B is 122.73%, and C is what, 122 point, or 122, whatever, 0.7, right? You can't miss by rounding alone. The answer choices aren't that close. And that's what we mean by that. Always go out at least 2 decimal places, if not 3, so you can get the one that's the closest. Questions? Change in equity is part of original equity. Again, if you didn't get it wrong, do you see, or if you didn't get it right, if you didn't get it right, do you see where you went wrong? And I got some practice for you guys. Knowing the formulas, get those things on flashcards, or you guys started a piece of paper, called it formulas. What do we expect to see on the exam for this? So don't forget, you got the math workbook. All math is red because you got to pick the calculator up and do something. You got to do something. So all math is a red star. Remember that math workbook in the online learning system tells you what math you can expect to see on my end of class exam. It also tell you the math that you may see on your state exam. So use that math workbook and the math paper, right? Questions? You guys ready to be done with math? Well, I am. You guys aren't. But we collectively are. So that's it. No more math. You guys have, again, refer to that math workbook so you know what to expect on my test and what to expect on our end of class exam. The end of unit 18. New book people, you're on page 498. Old book people, you're on 474. The end of unit 18 does have some math like we just did. There's also those 50 problems in the back of the book. Old book people, I think you start on page 803. These are the numbers that relate to investors math. There's also a worksheet, I think, in the online learning system. Profit and loss, present value is part of original value, and change in equity. Questions?
So you said like for the exam, about how much in math should we expect?
There's 8 on mine, and you can expect 8 to 10 on the state exam. I feel the need, I got some blank looks, so I feel the need to, I'll come back to that. In the online learning system, there's a category called math. And within that category is the math workbook. Page 1 of the math workbook tells you what math you can expect to see on your broker exam, your state exam, that you may see on your state exam. And then it also gives you the math that you can expect to see on my exam. So if you don't do anything else with the math workbook, look at the first page to help you focus your study time. Fair? And I say what math you may see on the state exam. Guys, remember, your state exam is a test bank of questions. When you sit down, it's got 500 questions on math. And when you sit down, beep, boop, boop, it gives you 8 of those. You with me? So you may have some math this time, somebody else may have different math. I can't promise you this is what you're going to see, but I can tell you this is what you may see. Also, please always remember, you guys, you're not preparing to take a math test. You're preparing to take a real estate exam with some math in it. The math alone can't fail you. Don't let the math stress you out. I'd rather you guys be stressed out over agency and contracts than math. If you can use the math to your advantage, ta-da. Questions, comments? Yeah, here's some extra math. Here's a profit and loss. Some extra practice in here as well. Unit 12 material. So question about where do we find how many questions from each unit? If you look at the real estate licensing in North Carolina booklet under the welcome section, it's page 16. And that gives you the breakdown. How many can you expect to see from agency? How many can you expect to see from contracts? How many can you expect to see on landlord and tenant? It's in the relink book on page 16. Other questions or comments, concerns? Let's see where we are. It's a good checkpoint. Of course. So we are going to start Unit 19. Concern comes in about knowing all the laws and knowing which is which. I recommend, this is where I recommend like flashcards, or again, even a piece of paper if you just jot them down. You know, this is, and remember guys, with license law and commission rule, you don't need to know the specific laws and rules. You just need to be familiar with them. If we give you a number, it's just a reference. But in addition to license law and commission rule, you have other acts and laws that we need to be aware of as well, like the North Carolina Residential Rental Agreement Act, North Carolina Tenant Security Deposit Act, for example. So these are going to come up as Connor Act, statute of fraud. So these are going to come up as you start reviewing, and you're going to see those, what we need to be in compliance with. Okay. Again, I know we're a little early on break. I think we're just early in general today, but I'm not going to start a unit for 3 minutes and then say, okay, let's take a break. So let's go ahead and take 10. When we come back, fair housing. So we're getting into Unit 19. back. So I am, cameras are popping on. Welcome back. I am taking attendance. We are jumping into Unit 19, which is our fair housing unit. How many of you got a chance to look at Unit 19 before class today? Just curious. A few of you? Good, thank you. Unit 19, as mentioned, is not only important for your exams, you will have test questions on Unit 19. This unit is even more important for your career. It's important that we as agents know and follow fair housing. I don't know much that can get you in trouble faster than a violation of fair housing. So it all starts here. Again, we're just scratching surfaces and introducing you to it. You'll get more on fair housing and post-licensing. You'll get more on fair housing as you affiliate with your firms. The National Association of Realtors has set aside April as Fair Housing Month. So there's always some good literature, some good information that comes out of NAR. I mean, all year round on fair housing as it updates, but specifically in the month of April. Understand this going into. Fair housing is not here for you to agree with or disagree with. Your personal beliefs, your personal opinions mean nothing when it comes to fair housing. So fair housing is what it is, and it's important that we understand and follow it. So our roadmap, we're going to talk about the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and how that evolved to become fair housing as we know it today. Fair housing gives us a list of who the protected classes are. So we're going to define those protected classes and talk about what that means. And then North Carolina also has our own state level of fair housing. So we're going to start with focusing on federal fair housing, and then we're going to compare it to state fair housing and see how those fare. So to start off with fair housing, what we're talking about is equal opportunity in housing. If we were to take a few steps back, thank you for letting me know that you guys are back, by the way. If you haven't, please do. If we were to take a few steps back, the big picture of fair housing, says that everybody should have the right to live wherever they want, as long as it's in their financial means. Big picture of fair housing. Everybody should have the right to live, buy or rent, wherever they want, as long as it's within their financial means. As a licensee's failure to comply with fair housing, you could be in court, you could be dealing with disciplinary action. Again, I don't know much that can get you in trouble faster than a violation of fair housing. As far as who has to comply with fair housing, anybody involved in the housing process. So of course the real estate agent, but you also have builders and developers. If you walk into a model home, for example, the on-site agent would have to comply with fair housing. Lending agencies, although lenders have their own protected classes. So we're going to do a comparison with our protected classes versus the lender's protected classes. Please also hear me, you guys. When we talk about fair housing, we're talking about the dwelling. We're going to define that word dwelling in just a second. But these are private spaces. Fair housing covers private spaces. ADA picks up the public accommodations. So fair housing is about the dwelling. ADA is about the public spaces, the public accommodations. And again, we'll do a side-by-side comparison on the two at the end of this unit. So let's go back in time. Quick history lesson for you. Fair housing all started, it originated from the Civil Rights Act of 1866. My history buffs in here will tell you this is about the time that we're wrapping up the Civil War and we were freeing slaves. And with that came new rules and new laws, including the Civil Rights Act of 1866. What this act did is it prohibited discrimination on the basis of race and color. Now we'll define race and color in just one second. Race and color are still a protected class today, again, where it all evolved, Civil Rights Act of 1866. This is one of few laws that is still around today. So we still cannot discriminate on the basis of race and color. One thing that sets this apart, one thing that makes this unique, when we're referring to the Civil Rights Act of 1866, I'm not necessarily just referring to housing. No exemptions are allowed on the basis of discrimination on the basis of color when you're dealing with housing, commercial, employment, what else? Pickup game of dodgeball. There are no exemptions. No matter what avenue, what we're looking at, we're never, per this act, allowed to discriminate on the basis of race and color. So this is where it originated. Fast forward in time. We started in 1866, and we're going to fast forward, what, 102 years to 1968. In 1968, the Civil Rights Act evolved and became known as Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act, what we refer to today as fair housing. And when we evolved to fair housing in 1968, race and color are still included. But then we added religion and national origin. Again, we will define the protected classes in just a second. I do think you guys should know the years that the protected class came to be protected. We'll talk about that in a second. So 1866, we had race and color. 1968, in addition to race and color, we added religion and national origin. 1968 is when we adopted fair housing as we know it today. Fast forward again. Let's fast forward to 1974. In 1974, we picked up sex as a protected class. Sex, again, we'll define in just a second. And then fast forward, by the way, what was happening in 74 around this time? Women's lib. We were getting to vote. We could buy a house if we wanted to. We could rent an apartment if we wanted to. So as our society evolves, as things change, fair housing has to keep up with what's going on. Fast forward one more time to 1988. We picked up handicap or disability conditions and familial status. And again, I will define familial status in just one second. As mentioned, I think you guys need to know the date. I wouldn't put it past them on your exam to say something like the year was 1972 and a woman was applying for an apartment and she felt she was declined her application because she was a woman. In 1972, could you deny an application because of their gender, because of their sex? Sure. In 1972, yeah, because sex was not a protected class. So I think it's important that we know the years that the classes came to be. Look with me in your book, please. Page 501, new book. 477, old book, people. So my new book people are on 501. My old book people are on 477. I like the chart. The chart shows us what class, what act, and what class became protected in each act. So you can see very clearly the years and what classes. The very last thing on that chart is the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. That's the lenders protected classes. We introduced these to you in Unit 15. And we can see by looking at the chart that the lenders protected classes and ours are similar, but there are some differences. So with the lenders, they have age as a protected class, as long as the applicant is 18 years of old, 18 years old. old. Marital status for the lenders is a protected class, and public assistance for housing income is a protected class. So again, I like the nice side-by-side comparison. And I do think you guys should know what class became protected when. Questions so far before we define the protected classes? So one way we can easily remember the protected classes is to remember Fred's corn. Fred's corn help us remember specifically what the protected classes are. The F in Fred is our familia status. Familia status is about the children. Anybody under 18 years, you cannot deny somebody housing because they have kids. Kids are the protected class. I think this comes up more often in the lease situation than it does the sale, but it does come up in the sale, absolutely. We'll talk more about familia status. Familia status, again, is about the children, those under the age of 18. It also includes women with children. Women with child, I should say, pregnant women. The R in Fred's is race. Race is the group of people that an individual was born into or has affiliated with their whole lives. So race is the group of people the individual was born into or has affiliated with. The E in Fred is not a protected class. I needed a filler to spell the name. So the E in Fred, equal rights for all, helps us remember why we're here. The D in Fred is disability, also handicap condition. You may see this spelled out as fresh corn. The difference in if you say fresh or Fred's is if you say disability or handicap. I choose to use Fred's. You guys see fresh, that know that we have our handicap disability. A disability or a handicap is any physical or mental impairment that limits one or more of life's major activities. Some kind of physical or mental impairment that limits one or more of life's major activities. Those with a disability or handicap cannot be discriminated against with housing. Back in Unit 7, we introduced you guys to material facts. And then we also talked about things that are not material facts. And one thing that is not a material fact are stigmatized properties. And there was one exception to this rule. Does anybody remember the exception to our stigmatized properties? We can volunteer the information, except for one exception. I'm getting it in the chat. Yep.
HIV status?
That's right. If you're ever asked, did anybody ever live in this home that has AIDS or HIV? Your answer is always, federal fair housing prohibits me from answering that. Those with AIDS or HIV are a protected class under disability handicap. And if you're ever asked for rent or for sale, if you're ever asked, did anybody ever live in this home that had AIDS? Your answer is always, federal fair housing prohibits me from answering that. The S in Fred's is referring to sex. That's referring to an individual's gender, the gender that they identify with. Now, I need you guys to make a correction to your book. I was so hoping the new book would update this, but it didn't. So new book and old book people, I need you to make a correction. New book people, you're on 501. Old book people, you're on 477. 501 and 477 define sex, and they say does not protect sexual orientation or gender identity. As of February 2021, sexual orientation and gender identity are protected under the category of sex. Did everybody hear me? As of, and you don't need to know the year, but as of February 2021, gender identity and sexual orientation are protected under the category of sex. Again, you guys, as our society continues to evolve, so does our fair housing to make it fair for all. We're trying to prevent any kind of discrimination for housing. Remember what that big picture says. Everybody should have the right to live wherever they want, as long as it's within their financial means. So everybody make that correction in your book. Sexual orientation and gender identity are now protected under the category of sex. Let's break down corn. The C in corn is color. It's referring to the actual color of a person's skin. So race is the group of people they identify with. Color is the actual color of an individual's skin. The O in corn is not a protected class. Again, I just needed it for a filler so I could spell the word. The R in corn is referring to the individual's religion, their spiritual beliefs. We cannot discriminate based on their religion, their spiritual beliefs. And then the N in corn is the national origin, the country that the individual was born from, or where their direct ancestors come from. So national origin is where the individual hails from, either where they were born or where their direct ancestors. So I'm getting a lot of questions on fair housing. Please bear with me. We're getting there. It's important that we understand the protected classes. This is what fair housing says about the protected classes. Fair housing does not say, these are the protected classes. Don't you say anything bad about it. That's not what fair housing's about. Fair housing says, these are the protected classes. Don't say anything at all. We cannot discuss the protected classes. This kind of run aligns. Let's go back to our Unit 7 discussion. Remember, with like dual agency, you can talk about the property all day long. You cannot talk about the people. What am I telling you in fair housing? We can talk about the property all day long. We cannot have discussions about the people. Now, this gets tricky because I'm getting the what if you're working with buyers and they say, I want to live in a neighborhood with kids. Well, it's not like I'm going to stick my fingers in my ears and go, la, 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 we can't talk about it. A big part of my job is helping to educate the public. And when the public starts asking about neighborhoods with good kids, we need to direct them towards the amenities. Is it a good school district you're looking for? Is there a playground at the end of the street? How do you know if there's kids around? You look for the amenities. You look for the things that kids like. I can't guarantee you there's kids in this neighborhood. I don't know the neighbors. I can't tell you who's around. And if there are kids in this neighborhood, I can't promise you that they're going to like and want to play with your kids. So how are we going to avoid this? We're not going to talk about the kids. We're not going to talk about the people. We talk about the amenities. We talk about what's nearby. If your kid wants to be in a special school district, I will get them in that school district. So we need to be very careful. And guys, I'm telling you, you're going to come across this on the regular. You're going to be with a seller at a listing appointment. And that seller may look at you and say, I don't want to sell my house to fill in the blank of a member of a protected class. The only thing that the seller should see is money. That's all they should be focusing on. They should not be focusing on the people. And if you have a seller that's adamant about only selling to a certain protected class or not selling to a protected class, you have a decision to make. If we can't get this seller to budge, I can't work with them. My job is to educate the public. We're going to learn in just a second, sellers on their own may be able to discriminate. But once they bring an agent into the mix, we all have to follow fair housing. And this is a big place for us to help educate those sellers. Well, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I appreciate what you're telling me. However, fair housing says we cannot discriminate based on that protected class. When an offer comes in, we'll review the terms. We're not going to talk about the people. We're going to talk about the terms of the offer. And that's where we need to help educate the public. If I'm talking about the people, is to help my clients, my customers understand that they are potentially violating fair housing. So a question comes in, you have a client looking to move into a neighborhood with children, you can't disclose that? That's right. I can't talk about the kids. Again, what's nearby? Is there a playground? Is there a walking trail or a bike trail that they can access? What schools are around? It's about the amenities, you guys. We can talk about the property and the location all day long. We cannot talk about the people. Now I'm going to do some expanded definitions. We're going to talk a little bit more about familial status and disability in just 1 second, make sure we have a good understanding. But again, what we're understanding right now, fair housing does not say, be nice. Fair housing says, don't discuss it all. And I'm not telling you guys to divert the conversation. I'm telling you to help educate the public and let them know why we can't talk about children in the neighborhood, why we need to focus on the playgrounds. I got an exception. We're getting there. In Unit 19, we do have an exception for retirement communities. So please bear with me. We'll talk about those in a second. Specific just to the protected classes. What questions do we have? Fred's Corn. So where's all this come from? Well, fair housing is a division, a department of HUD. I'm sure you guys have heard of HUD, our Housing and Urban Development. There's a division of HUD that enforces fair housing. You guys, 502, no new book people, 578, old book people. There's a version of our equal housing opportunity poster. And one thing that HUD requires is that this poster be placed in businesses that have to abide by fair housing where the public can see it. So when you walk in the front door of a real estate firm or you walk in the front door of a model home, we should be able to see that equal housing opportunity poster, because that's telling the public this real estate firm or this developer honors fair housing. They do not discriminate against those protected classes. As a matter of fact, HUD feels so strongly about this poster. They say failure to put the poster up could on its face be seen as discrimination. So if you say, nah, I'm not going to clout my walls with that poster, they know that could be a sign of discrimination in and amongst itself. So making sure we see the public, more importantly, sees these, this poster. That's not going to happen. Every firm has to have an office location. So you got to have a physical address. So if that's your physical address, then that's where it needs to be. Yep. If the public's going to be there. That's who we're educating here, you guys. Helping to educate the public of fair housing when it comes to purchasing properties. So let's look at kind of some expanded definitions When we're talking about housing, we're talking about the dwelling. Again, I'm talking about fair housing. May this be for rent? May this be for sale? We're talking about the unit intended for occupancy. And that's what fair housing is protecting. It's the dwelling. As mentioned, and again, we'll do a side-by-side comparison. ADA picks up where fair housing leaves off. Familial status. These are children and pregnant women. I think we run into this more with the lease situation than we do the for sale. I think in some lease situations, landlords may say, I don't want to rent to families with kids because let's face it, kids destroy stuff, don't they? They like to take purple crayon on walls, and they like to like cut stuff and do stuff and punch stuff, and kids just do stuff. That's just what kids do. And you may have a landlord that may try to say, I'm not going to rent to a family with kids. Can that landlord do that? Absolutely not. Remember the big picture. What you do for one, you do for all. It's not up to the landlord or the owner to decide what's best for that family with kids. If that family, let's say you have a large apartment building, and this apartment building has 20 stories, and you have a family applying for a unit on the 19th floor with 2 young children, the landlord may think they're doing what's best for that children by saying, I don't want you on the 19th floor. It's too risky for your kids. Can the landlord make that decision? No. Fair housing says everybody should live wherever they want, as long as it's within their financial means. So if this family with children wants to live on the 19th floor and their application proves that they can afford to live on the 19th floor, I can't deny them that apartment because they have kids.
How about the 2 human per room? If you've got more kids than rooms,
And that's if we're on an on-site septic system. So if we're on an on-site septic system, and that's not for fair housing, that's for the capacity of the septic tank. Now, if you're on public sewer, no problem, right? I'm getting another question about elderly communities. You guys, please bear with me. I promise we're getting to that. Another question for sale and for lease, kind of piggybacking off what we just addressed. For sale and for lease, you're going to be asked, are there kids in this neighborhood? We can't talk about the people. Guys, remember back in unit 7 or 8, we said buyers, or 9 or 10, buyers should be encouraged to drive around the neighborhood at different times of the day anyway. They want to see what the house looks like when the sun's rising, when the sun's setting. They drive around the neighborhood enough, they may or may not see kids, right? They can determine this on their own. They don't need me. What do I know about the neighborhood? What do I know about the people that live in the neighborhood? If you see a kid on a bike, can you assume he lives here? Well, no, but we know if we see multiple kids on bikes, then the buyers can come to the conclusion that kids live in this neighborhood. But when they ask you, do kids live in this neighborhood? I can't address that. I can't have that conversation. Again, I'm not trying to stick my fingers in my ears and go, la, 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 I'm not hearing you. Again, what we're saying is, I understand you have a family and you want good accommodations for your kids. What specifically are you looking for? A good school, a playground, a rec center nearby, somewhere that they can go play after work. You guys with me? I can talk about the property and the amenities. I cannot talk about the people. So familiar status is our children under 18. We're not discriminated against, and this does include pregnant women as well, women with child. The last one there is our handicap disability status. I think where this comes up the most is the for lease situation. an applicant cannot be denied accommodations because they have a handicap disability status. Landlords cannot not allow the tenant to make accommodations to the home. If the tenant's in a wheelchair and they want to add a ramp to get to the front door, the landlord cannot say no. If they're in a wheelchair and they want to lower the kitchen cabinets or put grab bars in the shower, the landlord can't say no. They have to allow the tenant to make these modifications and accommodations to the home to fit their handicap condition. The landlord doesn't have to pay for it. They can require the tenant to pay for it. There are a lot of programs out there for handicapped tenants to take advantage of, that they can apply for the funds to build the ramp or put the grab bars in the shower, whatever they need. The landlord can also require the tenant to put it back to the original condition when they're done. So we can work some things out to protect the landlord. But the one thing the landlord can't do is say, no, you can't put a ramp here. No, you can't put grab bars in the shower. If the individual needs it, if the tenant needs it for their handicap disability condition, the landlord has to allow it. I also want to point out under handicap, page 504, new book, 480, old book. You guys see that in practice? Those in recovery are covered under handicap disability status. Current users are not. Everybody see that? Legal and illegal drugs, medications, etc. There's a lot to take into consideration before you allow somebody to rent your home. And part of what we need to take into consideration is that you very well may get an applicant from somebody that falls under the handicap disability status. Again, the landlord doesn't have to pay for it. They can require it to be put back in its original position at the end of the lease. But the landlord can't say, no, don't do that. That's what's protected. That's what's covered under handicap disability status. I want you guys, I like Unit 19 a whole lot. It offers us some good examples, some good in practices. So go back to the previous page, 503 and 479. Just to point out, there's some Fair Housing Act restrictions and some examples. Kind of gives you an idea. I do really, really, really like these examples in Unit 19. So we'll point them out as we go. So, as we can imagine, as mentioned, there are some exemptions to fair housing. Some exemptions to fair housing. The sale or rental of a single family home is exempt is someone that does not own more than 3 houses at a time. This is not an investor. Investors are not exempt. However, the for sale by owner may be exempt under fair housing. Someone that does not own 3 or more homes at a time for sale or for rent, that individual would not have to abide by fair housing. However, every time that a real estate agent gets involved in the transaction, there are no exemptions to fair housing. You and I never are allowed to have that exemption. So the for sale by owner could discriminate, but if they hire an agent or if the buyer comes with an agent, discrimination goes out the window. Anytime an agent gets involved. Now, I know this first bullet point here kind of bumps on some of our moral compasses. I got a solution for you in just 1 second, so bear with me. The other exemption that's never allowed. You can never advertise your discrimination. So let's say you're a for sale by owner, or let's say you're a for rent by owner. And you decide, no, FRBO too. You are the owner, you're renting or selling. So you're the FRBO, for rent by owner, and you decide to rent. You have one home and you want to rent it out. You decide you want to choose, you want to be selective over who rents that home from you. You may know in your mind that you don't want to rent to women. You don't want women to live in that unit. I don't know why, but you don't. What you can't do is advertise your discrimination. You can't say men only apply. Does that make sense? So the for sale by owner, the individual, they might be able to discriminate. No agent is involved, but nobody is allowed to advertise their discrimination. You cannot have an apartment complex, units for rent, and say no kids. You cannot advertise that discrimination. Do we see it all the time on Craigslist? Oh my gosh, it hurts me. Actually pains me to see Craigslist. Does that make it right? Yeah. What does fair housing say? And that's what we're focusing on. Again, I got a solution to this. Bear with me. I'll make you feel better. Also exempt rental in an owner occupied 1 to 4 family dwelling. So if you have a 4-unit complex and you live in one of the units, you can choose who rents the other 3. You can't advertise that discrimination, but you could choose. Maybe you're a female and you only want females to rent the other 3 units. As long as it's one of the units is owner occupied. I know, moral compass, I hear you. Remember, Civil Rights Act of 1866 says you can never discriminate against race or color. There are no exceptions to that, ever. Also exempt are religious organizations when property is owned by its member or used by its member. I tend to think of like the church parsonage. The church owns a home. They choose who lives there, and they can say only the members of our congregation can rent that home. So that would be an exemption. Same thing with private clubs. If you have an Elks Lodge that has a cabin up in the mountains, they can say only our members can rent that cabin. They're not discriminating, they're just limiting to their members. And then also exempt is our housing for older persons, our retirement communities. The only exemption is the familia status. And what we're exempting is kids. How do retirement communities get away with it? Because it was how they were built. It was how they were designed. They were set up in a way that says this is only for those that are, for example, 62 years or older. Again, the only thing we're exempting is the familia status. They still have to follow race, color, religion, national origin, sex, and handicap, disability. They were intended for elderly retirement. That's what they were built. And so they are allowed to exempt from the familia status. Now, you have a retirement community. Can the grandkids go visit grandma and grandpa this weekend? Can they pack up their little backpack and go have a slumber party and stay the night the weekend? Of course they can. Of course they can. What they can't do is live there. And that's what the exemption is. It's the kids. Fair housing, we said, is a division of HUD. How fair housing is enforced is that division. So the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity falls under HUD, and that's who enforces fair housing. Under federal fair housing, if somebody has reason to believe that they were discriminated against based on one of the members of the protected class, the claimant has up to a year after the offense to file the complaint. So if you feel that you're the victim of fair housing, or if your client feels that they're the victim of fair housing, they can file the complaint up to a year after the violation. The Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, once a complaint is filed, they'll launch an investigation. They're going to ask all parties lots of questions. The agent, they may dig a little deeper. They may want to make sure that in your business, what you're doing for one, you're doing for all. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. We'll bring that home for us. So they're going to investigate, talk to both parties, gather documentation. And if they find that there was a violation of fair housing, federal fair housing, this could be pursued in a court of law. The violator could also face civil or criminal penalties. We're looking here. You could be looking at damages, just to give you an idea. You could be looking at damages of $10,000 for the first offense. They don't just slap you on the wrist and say, don't do it again. First offense is a slap on the wrist with $10,000, $25,000 for second offense, $50,000 on third offense or more. So the offenses keep adding, they keep accumulating. And as a North Carolina real estate licensee, you violate fair housing, please don't think that the North Carolina Real Estate Commission won't get involved and you face possible disciplinary action as well. If the complaint's filed with the commission, they may choose to push it up to the fair housing level. If somebody hires an attorney or a fair housing level is initiated, they'll probably send it down, report it down to the North Carolina Real Estate Commission. I'm not kidding you guys. I don't know something that can't get you in trouble faster than violating fair housing. So making sure that we have an understanding of the protected classes and understanding what fair housing says. You can talk about the property and the amenities and the locations all day long. We cannot talk about the people. And even sometimes about the amenities. I mean, sometimes I see an ad, a house, maybe a house for sale, and it's across the street from Ardmore Baptist Church. What's the implication here? The unintended implication, if you're Baptist, isn't this a great home for you? Now, I understand in the ad, a lot of times what the agent's doing is they're giving us a location, right? If you know Winston, you know where Ardmore Baptist Church is. I understand that's what the intent is. But what is the unintended consequences to the consumer? And that's where fair housing says that's where we need to be careful. So you could say it's in Ardmore, but I would be cautious about across the street from Ardmore Baptist Church. Again, the unintended implication here. Questions on federal fair housing and those protected classes. Let's bring it down to the state level. North Carolina also has, we also have North Carolina fair housing. Good news. The protected classes in North Carolina fair housing are the same as the protected classes in federal fair housing. Not all states can say this. There's 7 protected classes in federal fair housing. California, I've heard, has like 14 protected classes. North Carolina, we keep it simple. Our protected classes are the same. By the way, we didn't adopt state fair housing until 1983. And for the most part, it piggybacks off of federal fair housing. It allows complaints to be filed on several different levels. However, if you file a complaint at the state level, it's going to get pushed up to the federal level. You file a complaint at the federal level, there's a good chance it'll get pushed down to the state. So the two do work together. There are a few differences. One difference in federal and state. We said that federal allows an exemption when it's owner occupied with 1 to 4 units. I'm sorry, that's the next slide. Okay, if it's owner occupied, So federal allows the exemption for the for sale by owner or the for rent by owner, someone that does not own more than 3 homes. Good news. State tightens that up. State says, yeah, no, the FSBO can't discriminate. The FRBO cannot discriminate. Federal allows it, state does not. Does that make us feel a little bit better? Whenever you have a conflict of rules, the stricter of the two will prevail. So even though federal allows it, in this case, North Carolina is more strict. So in North Carolina, the FSBO and the FRBO under state fair housing cannot discriminate. They are not exempt. Again, anytime you have a conflict of rules, the stricter of the two will prevail. That's how the deciding factor is. So federal allows for an exemption for somebody that does not own more than three homes for sale or for rent. State says, yeah, no, the FSBO, the FRBO cannot discriminate. Another big difference between the two, this is what I was trying to say earlier. The federal allows for an exemption if the owner lives in the unit. State allows for an exemption if the owner or a family member lives in the unit. So it broadens it a bit. Again, if it goes down, the stricter of the two will prevail. Which one is more strict? In this case, it's our federal law. What if someone owns 3 homes and uses a realtor? Whenever an agent gets involved, discrimination is never allowed. So if the FSBO hires or the FRBO hires an agent, now discrimination, they used to could until they brought an agent into the transaction. Once we're around, discrimination can never happen. So federal,
is
yeah.
the state law not more strict because it's for the owner and their family member?
Right, but this one is more strict because it's only the owner.
Oh, okay.
So there's a more strict. So again, federal is going to prevail on this one. Again, if it goes down and we're standing in front of a court, in front of a judge, the judge is going to go with the stricter of the two. So just understanding those few differences between federal and state. Again, we got the protected classes. There's another exemption for state that federal doesn't have. And state law has an exemption on our single sex dorms. So things like our college dorms, military barracks, that kind of thing. Those single sex dorms are exempt from from state fair housing, North Carolina fair housing. Another big difference between federal and state is the state enforcement. State is enforced by the department called the North Carolina Human Relations Commissions. Again, the complainant has up to a year after the offense to file the complaint. You file a complaint with the North Carolina Human Relations Commissions, there's a great chance it could get pushed up to the federal level. You file a complaint on the federal level, there's a really good chance it could get pushed down to the state. They're going to investigate. Licensees, they're going to ask us for our documentation. Again, we'll bring this home. We'll talk about us. We won't get to it today, but we'll finish this up on Thursday. Questions on state level? Fair housing, federal fair housing, also gives us some prohibited acts, prohibited practices. One prohibited practice is called block busting, also known as panic peddling. Please write this down. Block busting is about the owners. Block busting is when you're talking to sellers and landlords. It's about the owners. And what block busting prohibits, what fair housing doesn't allow, is the act of encouraging people to sell or rent their home by claiming the entry of a protected class into the neighborhood could have some kind of negative impact. It's called panic peddling. You cannot look at a seller or a renter, an investor, encourage them to sell or rent by claiming that the entry of a protected class into the neighborhood will have some kind of negative impact. Steering, then, also known as channeling, write that down, is about the buyers and tenants. Steering and channeling is about the buyers and the tenants. You cannot steer a buyer or a tenant into or away from a certain neighborhood because of the presence of protected classes in the neighborhood. You cannot steer buyers or tenants into or away from. When I meet with a buyer for the first time, if I'm in property management, if I meet for a tenant for the first time, I'm asking them questions like, what kind of house do you want? How many square feet? Do you need 2 stories? How many bedrooms do you need? How many bathrooms would you like? Do you want a full basement? If I once mentioned the people, I'm asking them property questions. I'm asking them what they want. They may choose which neighborhood they want to buy or lease in, but I'm going to show them what they have available and their home criteria. I'm not just going to focus on the neighborhood. I'm going to say, you told me you needed a 3-bedroom, 2-bath with a garage and an apartment over the garage. These are all the properties in my MLS that meet your criteria for the property. If they want to say, well, I only want to see these 2 because they're in the area that I want, that's them deciding. I'm showing them everything that's available that meets their criteria. Does that make sense? We can talk about the property all day long. We can talk about the number of bedrooms in the garage and fireplace. And when you tell me this is what you want, the types of properties you want to look for, I'm not steering you into or away from a certain neighborhood. Even if you say that's where you want to live. Guys, I'm telling you, it's been my experience. Many times when buyers start, it's not where or what they end up with. So if I'm only limiting searches to this neighborhood, they may be missing out on a great property over here. So we're showing them everything that fits their criteria and letting them choose what they want to see. Also prohibited, we said we can never advertise our discrimination. Advertisement, it got really big really fast with the onset of the internet, social media. Advertising changed rapidly and continues to change. So we need to make sure nobody, licensed or not, can advertise their discrimination. And then the last prohibited practice here is redlining. Redlining is about the lender. Redlining was a lender practice many years ago, 50s and 60s. They don't do it anymore, but they used to take a map of the city and put it on the wall. And then when they would take their red marker and they would literally walk up to the map and say, we're not going to originate loans here, here, or here. They would redline the map, and it would be automatic denial, not because of the property, not because of the people, but because of where it was located. Today, this isn't allowed. Lenders cannot refuse to make, lenders cannot make a mortgage loan because of the location. If you're being denied a loan, it comes down to your debt to income ratio doesn't shake out. Or if you're going FHA or VA, the property doesn't approve. You cannot deny loans because it's in this neighborhood or that area of town. That's redlining. And again, it's not allowed today. Questions? Turn with me, 510, new book people. Old book people, 486. And again, there's some advertising guidelines. There's certain words that HUD has said are better than others. And I'm telling you guys right now, this list changes as we speak. Again, new book, I wish they would have taken it out, but we're seeing the verbiage master bedroom being replaced with primary bedroom, owner suite. Some MLSs, including the Triad MLS, have already done away with a master bedroom, master bath, that verbiage, that terminology. So even as these books are being published, fair housing laws are updating or regulating. So I think this gives us a good idea. Just go into this with an understanding. And I also share with you guys the beginning of last year. I can't speak for all MLSs, but the Triad MLS implemented a new software. And when I'm putting a listing in, it'll flag words that make me think about using them. What do I mean by that? I was putting a listing in, we work with a lot of builders, and I was putting a listing in, and in the remarks, we were describing the white cabinets in the kitchen. And MLS flagged it. They didn't say you can't use it. They flagged it for me to make sure that I was using the word white appropriately, making sure I wasn't talking about the neighborhood or the people. Can you talk about the white cabinets? Absolutely. They flagged the word white. And again, they didn't say, no, you can't do that. They said, cautious, be cautious going forward that you're using this word appropriately. It's actually a great tool. 12 years ago, Fair Housing produces a list of words that may be a violation to fair housing and advertising. And y'all, 12 years ago, that list was like 26 pages long. I imagine since then that list has expanded. MLSs are taking that list. Those are the words that they're flagging. So it helps us. We have choices. You can either memorize those words on the 26 pages, or thank you, MLS, for implementing that software to give me the heads up just to make sure I'm using those words appropriately. So the prohibited practices, prohibited under fair housing. So let's talk about Thursday. Thursday, we're going to finish Unit 19. We're going to talk about, again, the last big piece of this is what does it mean for us? Also on Thursday, we are going to start on our license law and commission rule. with the emphasis, with the focus being on the comments. If you have not looked at this yet, please do. Not only is this going to be the majority of your state specific section, this is also a really good review, because if you look through this, you're going to see that it talks about things like agency, material facts, duties of the agent, agency agreements, working with real estate agent disclosure. How many of you have looked at the comments so far? How many of you? Good, 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 good. For the rest of you, please look ahead. This is where we're going on Thursday. So we're going to finish 19, and then we're jumping into our state specific section. Questions, comments? Don't forget to your new time for your cram course on Friday. The time has changed. It is now 8 to 12. I have a note to remind you guys on Thursday as well. Please make a note for yourself. 1 o'clock. Questions? All right. Y'all have a good afternoon. Please put the book down and go outside and get some vitamin D. It's really nice out there. So go take advantage of it. Promise me? Thank you. Yeah, come on. You can go. Have fun. I will
See
see
you
you
later.
guys Thursday morning. Let's see.